What if Harry Potter used Itachi's Tsukuyomi on the Dursleys and trapped them in 72 hours of their own cruelty? A Savage Harry Story Chapter 1, The Ninth Birthday Beating. Welcome to Savage Harry. Today's adventure, what if Harry Potter used Itachi's Tsukuyomi on the Dursleys and trapped them in 72 hours of their own cruelty? If you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Now let's begin. The morning of July 31, 1989, arrived at number 4, Privet Drive. With the kind of clean, prefabricated normalcy the Dursleys had cultivated like a religion. The sky outside the kitchen window was a flat municipal blue. The hedges had been clipped to within a millimeter of their lives. The milk on the doorstep stood in 3 glass bottles, foil tops glinting, arranged in a perfect arithmetic progression. Petunia had measured the spacing herself. She did this every Sunday. She did this on Harry's birthday, too, although she did not know it was Harry's birthday because no one in the house was permitted to know it was Harry's birthday. Because if anyone were permitted to know it was Harry's birthday, someone, most likely Dudley, might inadvertently say the word birthday in proximity to the boy, and the boy might come to believe that the day belonged in some small way to him, and that Petunia had decided would be intolerable. Harry was 9. He knew it was his birthday because he had counted the days on the inside of the cupboard door with the bent nail he had hidden under the slat of the bedboard. There were 365 marks in a long horizontal grid. He had crossed off the last one before he went to sleep. Today was a black painted square, today was nothing, today was a Sunday, today also was 9. He lay on his back in the cupboard under the stairs. The cupboard smelled, as it always did, of dust and floor cleaner and the faint Swedish rot of the spider egg sack Aunt Petunia had not noticed in the corner near the broom. The broom itself was a long-handled Hoover attachment that Petunia kept here, because Vernon insisted that the proper kitchen broom looked déclassé, propped behind the pantry door. Harry had given the spider egg sack a name, which was Wednesday, because that was the day he had first noticed it. Wednesday had not hatched. He had been watching for almost a year. He did not know what the spiders would look like when they came out, and he had decided in the cold, pragmatic way that comes to a child who has nothing to do but think that this was the best kind of friend to have, one that did not move, did not require feeding, and could not be taken away by Dudley. Harry got up. He moved with the small, economical efficiency of a boy who had learned by hard repetition that any sudden motion in the cupboard banged a shoulder, a knee, or the back of the skull against shelving, plumbing, or the underside of the stair. He did not turn on the light. He pulled on the jumper that had once been Dudley's, then Dudley's again, and was now a sort of gray-brown geological stratum of pulls and snags through which the original red was barely visible. He pushed open the cupboard door, slid out, and pulled it closed behind him with the quiet, accurate motion of a thief in his own house. The kitchen was already going. Bacon hissed in the pan. Petunia stood at the stove in her quilted dressing gown, her back perfectly straight, her hair pinned in a way that suggested she had spent 20 minutes inflicting violence upon it. Dudley sat at the table, already in his Sunday clothes, swinging his legs with the bored ferocity of a small siege engine waiting for a wall. Vernon was at the head of the table, behind the Sunday Telegraph, behind a cup of coffee, behind a haze of aftershave so dense it had its own weather system. Vernon was drunk. Harry registered this the way a deer registers the wind. Vernon was not loudly drunk. Vernon was Sunday drunk, which was the slow, sealed magisterial drunkenness of a man who had begun with a pull from the bottle in the cabinet at 6 in the morning and was now, at 9:43, in the steady-state cruising altitude of the genuinely impaired. Harry could tell from the angle of his shoulders. He could tell from the way the newspaper trembled just slightly at the bottom edge. He could tell from the way Petunia's back was straighter than usual, which was the body language equivalent of a barometric reading. Harry, at 9, had become very good at reading barometers. "Boy," said Vernon without looking up. "Yes, Uncle Vernon, you'll do the garden." "Yes, Uncle Vernon." "All of it, the roses, the lawn, the edges, and then the windows." "Yes, Uncle Vernon," and not a sound. "Yes, Uncle Vernon," the newspaper crackled. Petunia's spatula scraped the pan. Dudley, with the timing of a born torturer, kicked Harry hard under the table on the shin. Harry did not move. He did not change his face. He had learned long ago that the wrong face was worse than the kick. He went out to the garden. By 11, the sun had risen properly. The lawn was already shorn, the edges already squared, the roses already deadheaded. He had been out for less than 2 hours, and there was, in honest fact, very little for him to do because Petunia had insisted on doing most of it the day before. The garden was an alibi. Harry was more accurately banished. He understood this. He stood by the rose bed in the small posture of a boy who had run out of work and was waiting to be punished for it. He listened to the house. The house was making the wrong sounds. Vernon's voice was rising in the front room, not at Harry, not yet. At the telegraph, at Channel 4, at a noise from the upstairs flat next door, at an imagined slight by an imagined party. Vernon's drunkenness, when it reached a certain altitude, required a target. It moved through the house like weather looking for a place to break. Harry knew, with the precise, clean, cold knowledge of a boy who had been struck for less, that the weather was going to break on him. He did not panic. He had not panicked in a long time. Panic was the small, frantic flailing of a creature that still believed someone would come. Harry had stopped believing that at approximately 7.5. What replaced panic in him was an enormous still attentiveness, a kind of internal hush that came down over his thinking like a sheet of clean glass. In that hush he could hear everything: the rose thorns scraping the brick, the shift of Vernon's feet on the carpet 2 rooms away, the change in pitch of Petunia's voice when she was trying to defuse him and failing, the small wet sound of Dudley laughing at the television. Vernon stepped into the back garden at 12:06. He had a glass in one hand. He had taken off the jacket and the tie. His face was the deep brick color of a man who had been refilling. He looked at Harry. He looked at the rose bed. He looked at the perfectly trimmed edge of the lawn. He looked at Harry again. And Harry watched, in that hush, the precise instant in which Vernon decided what the offense was going to be. There was no offense. Vernon, with the connoisseurship of a long-practiced cruelty, did not need one. He was simply deciding what he was going to say it had been. "You missed a spot," Vernon said. Harry looked at the lawn. There was no spot. "Yes, Uncle Vernon, on the rose. Yes, Uncle Vernon, don't yes, Uncle Vernon me. Sorry, Uncle Vernon, what did I tell you about sorrying? Sorry, Uncle Vernon." The first blow came across the side of his face, open-handed. Harry's head snapped sideways. The taste of blood arrived in his mouth a half-second later, copper and warm. He did not fall. He had stopped falling at 7. Falling, he had learned, encouraged repetition. The trick was to remain upright, which was a kind of insult to a man who needed you to be on the ground, which made him angrier, which made the second blow harder, but the second blow was always coming anyway, and at least he had not given the first one the satisfaction. The second blow came backhanded on the other cheek. He tasted more blood. He saw a small bright burst of something at the edge of his vision that might have been a sparkle of sun on a glass of water 2 gardens over, or might have been the inside of his own head making a sound. He kept his feet. "Get inside." "Yes, Uncle Vernon." The third blow caught him at the base of the neck as Vernon shoved him toward the back door. He stumbled. He did not fall. He went through the kitchen. Petunia did not look up. The bacon was off the heat now, and the kitchen smelled of cooling fat. Dudley sat at the table with the expression of a small Roman emperor at a particularly good Tuesday. Harry walked past him into the hall. Vernon had him by the back of the jumper now. The hand of a large man on the loose knit of an old sweater is a peculiar thing. It bunches the wool into a kind of ungainly handle, and the handle pulls at the throat, and the throat in a 9-year-old is a remarkably thin and pliant pipe. Harry stopped breathing for approximately 3 seconds because Vernon had inadvertently choked him while marching him to the cupboard. Harry registered this in the hush. He did not gasp. He let his vision tunnel and waited for it to clear. By the time they reached the cupboard, he was breathing again. Vernon did not put him in the cupboard. Vernon, in his Sunday-drunk altitude, had decided that the cupboard was insufficient. He turned Harry around in the hall, holding him by the front of the jumper now, and lifted him slightly off the floor. Harry's toes touched the hall carpet. He could feel the bristles. He had memorized the bristles. There were 2,700 bristles per square inch on Petunia's hall carpet because he had counted a patch once when he had been left on the floor for 9 hours after a previous incident. He had then multiplied. Counting things had become, like the hush, a thing he did when other people were ruining him. Vernon hit him in the stomach, once, twice. The third blow he made with the back of his fist, and that one was the one that lifted Harry off his feet entirely. He landed on the parquet at the foot of the stairs. He felt the impact along his spine all the way up to the back of his skull. The hush did not break. It expanded. It became, briefly, the size of the entire house. "You ruined her," Vernon said. The sentence arrived with the strange clarity of a man finally saying the thing he had been saying inside his head for 9 years. "Your mother, you ruined her. She would have come back to us. She would have come crawling back when she got tired of him. She would have cried at the kitchen door and Petunia would have taken her in and we would have had her, and you ruined her. You ruined all of it, you nasty little—" Vernon kicked him. This was new. Harry registered this in the hush, with a clean, cold attentiveness, the way a meteorologist registers an anomalous reading. Vernon had hit him many times. Vernon had slapped him, backhanded him, punched him, choked him, picked him up by the ear. Vernon had not in 9 years kicked him. Vernon kicked him now. Vernon kicked him in the ribs. Harry heard from a long way off a sound he had read about in books and never understood. He understood it now. It was the sound of a bone moving inside a body. It was specifically the sound of the 7th rib on the left, which had been the small bone of a small boy a quarter-second before, deciding it was no longer going to be a small intact bone of a small intact boy and parting just slightly along its grain. Harry made no sound. The hush had become an enormous lung. He breathed inside it. He could feel his eyelashes on his cheek when he blinked. Vernon stepped back. Vernon, in some recess of himself that was still measurable in millimeters of human, registered that he had gone past a line. He did not, however, stop. He went past the line a second time. He went past the line a third time. He kicked Harry in the leg, in the hip, and in the small of the back. He was wearing house slippers. The house slippers did not protect Harry, they protected Vernon by giving him a soft enough surface that he could keep going without bruising his own foot. Vernon kept going. Harry, on the floor, opened his eyes. He had not realized he had closed them. He opened them now. He looked up at Vernon. He looked directly at the underside of Vernon's chin and the small slack tremble of skin at the jowls and the broken capillary on the bridge of his nose and the watery green of his eyes, and he thought with a perfect quiet that he would later be unable to explain and would never fully recover from. I see you. Something happened behind his eyes. It was not pain, it was not light. It was a sensation he had no available word for, because no one had given him the words a child would need to describe the unbinding of inheritance. There was a small warm pressure inside his skull, behind both eye sockets, as if his own face were a door and a stranger were politely knocking on the inside of it from the wrong direction. The pressure was not unpleasant. It was, in fact, the first non-painful sensation Harry had felt in approximately 24 hours. He almost wanted to lean into it. He did lean into it. He looked at Vernon and he leaned behind his own eyes into the warm pressure, and the pressure leaned back, and something in his head, something that had been locked for 9 years behind 100 small turned keys, quietly unbolted. There was, deep under Harry's skin, the residue of his mother's last act. It had been put there on a Tuesday in October 1981 by a woman of 21 who had stood between her child and a wand, and who had told her child in a voice that did not shake that he was loved. The residue had a name in books that Harry had never read. It had a chemistry that no one alive understood. It sat inside him like a quiet bell, and it had in 9 years never rung. There was also, deep under Harry's skin, an inheritance further back. Lily Evans's grandmother had been, against all village Cokeworth assumption, the daughter of a Japanese witch named Akemi who had come to England in 1922 with 3 trunks, a folded paper crane, and a pair of pale violet-gray eyes that had unsettled the village vicar so badly he had once gone home and dreamt of a forest at night with a moon in the wrong place. Akemi had not used her ocular gift for 46 years. She had not had to. The gift had passed, dilute into a daughter, and dilute again into Lily, and dilute again, theoretically dormant, into Harry, where it had waited like a folded crane in a drawer in a house. In the hall at Privet Drive, Harry leaned into the warm pressure, and the quiet bell rang, and the folded crane unfolded. It happened in a sequence he would later reconstruct only in fragments, because the order of the events did not match the order of any time he had previously experienced. First, his pupils contracted. Then his irises, behind the contracted pupils, flushed. The flush moved outward from the pupil in a slow spiral, the way blood will move into the tendrils of a sea anemone disturbed in clean water, except that the color it moved with was not blood. It was a deep arterial red shading toward black at the edges. Around each pupil a small black mark appeared, then another, like seeds dropped into clear water at 3 points of a small invisible triangle. The seeds spun briefly, almost gently, and then settled. 3 tomo in each eye, evenly spaced, motionless, watching. The watching was new, the watching was not metaphor. Harry was seeing for the first time in his life the way a hawk sees, the way a chess engine sees, the way a Sheringham sees, not the colors of a room but the structure of it. The angle of Vernon's right shoulder, 3 degrees lower than the left, indicating dominant arm fatigue from 12 consecutive blows. The microtremor at the corner of Vernon's mouth, indicating that the rage had begun to consume the man rather than the man consuming the rage. The thread of Vernon's chakra, and Harry had no word for chakra, would not have one for months, but he saw it nonetheless, running like a slow, bruised, swampish current through Vernon's body, thick at the gut, sluggish at the heart, almost dead in the forebrain. Harry saw, with a clarity that no 9-year-old should ever have to discover by accident, that Vernon was, in some deep biological sense, a hollow man. He also saw something else. He saw behind Vernon in the air of the hallway a faint shimmering disturbance that he later understood was his own protection, the residue of Lily's last act, uncoiling and joining hands with the awakening of his eyes. He saw very faintly in the air to his left the outline of a woman who was not in the room. She had her hand cupped at the side of his face. She did not speak. She nodded, then she was gone. Harry sat up. He sat up, he should not have been able to sit up. 3 of his ribs had been bruised and 1 had cracked, and the back of his head had a contusion the size of a saucer, and his lip was split and there was blood inside his ear. He sat up. The pain went somewhere, he did not lose it exactly, he simply put it in a different room of his mind and closed the door on it. The hush had become a kind of architecture inside him. He could move walls, he could put pain behind walls, he could put fear behind walls. He could, he discovered, put almost anything behind a wall except for the watching, which was now apparently the part of him that did the building. Vernon was still standing over him. Vernon had raised his hand for another blow. Vernon's hand was, in the small, slow time of the hush, moving with the dignified inevitability of an oil tanker. Harry looked up at him. He looked specifically at the underside of Vernon's left eye. He looked through it. He looked beyond the eye into the soft, wet machinery of Vernon's brain. He had no map of that machinery. He did not need one. What he had was a key and an ungentled instinct and the inheritance of a great-grandmother who had unfolded a paper crane in 1922 by looking at it. Harry looked. Harry, with the absolute calm of a boy who had been hit one too many times by someone he had stopped fearing approximately 4 minutes ago, opened his mouth and said in a voice that was just barely his own one word that he had never heard before in his life and would later be unable to explain how he knew. Tsukuyomi. The word did not echo. The word fell the way a stone falls into a well. The hallway did not change. Vernon did not change. The watching behind Harry's eyes simply reached for the first time with intention and caught Vernon's gaze and held it. There was a single second of perfect quiet, in the hallway, in the house, in the gardens up and down Privet Drive, in the air over Surrey. Somewhere in a stone office in London, a small silver instrument on the desk of an old woman who had been pouring herself tea began very gently to ring like a bell. Then Vernon's eyes rolled back in his head and Vernon, all 16 stone of him, came down in the hall like a felled tree. Harry did not move. Petunia screamed from the kitchen. The sound did not penetrate the hush. Petunia came around the corner with a tea towel still in her hand, the tea towel printed with a small geometric pattern of yellow flowers, the kind of pattern that had been on the towels of the kitchen of number 4 for 9 years and would not be there much longer. She saw Vernon on the floor. She saw Harry sitting up next to him with blood on his mouth. She saw Harry's eyes. Petunia, who had spent 8 years of her childhood watching her sister do impossible things in the back garden at Cokeworth and had never once, not once, admitted what she had seen, Petunia knew. The knowledge in her was not language. It was older than language. It was the small, cold, ancestral mammalian recognition of a predator that had not previously been in this neighborhood. She took one step back, she put her hand against the wall, she opened her mouth. Harry looked at her, Aunt Petunia. It was the politest sentence he had ever spoken in her hearing. It contained no anger. There was in fact in his voice the small dreadful calm of a piece of weather that has finished happening to other people and has now begun happening slowly on its own. Petunia did not answer. Petunia's mouth was open. Petunia's hand was on the wall. The tea towel hung from her other hand. Aunt Petunia, Harry said, look at me. She did. She could not help it. There is, in 9-year-old eyes with 3 spinning Tomo and 3,000 years of bloodline behind them, a particular gravitational thing that does not consult the wishes of the looker. She looked. She met his eyes. The hush in the hallway took her and held her and turned her gently, and the second word, the one Harry had now found he could say, fell into her in exactly the way it had fallen into Vernon. Tsukuyomi. Petunia did not collapse the way Vernon had. Petunia, who was thinner and who had higher blood pressure and who had been holding a tea towel, sat down quite gently against the wall of the hallway with her knees neatly folded and looked at nothing for the rest of the afternoon except for the things that the inside of her own head was now showing her. Dudley was in the kitchen. He had heard the sound of his father falling. He had not moved. Dudley was many things, and most of them were unkind, but he was also a child, and he was also, in the very small, uncalibrated reserves of his small body, afraid. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen now, holding the corner of the table, looking at his mother on the floor and his father on the floor and his cousin sitting upright between them with eyes the wrong color. Harry looked at Dudley. Harry, who had taken his first beating from Dudley at the age of 5.5 and who had been kicked, tripped, shoved, and bitten by Dudley several hundred times across the intervening years, looked at Dudley and felt, for the first time in his life, a small, unfamiliar pity. Dudley was a child. Dudley was a fat, unhappy child who had been taught by his father to be cruel because his father did not know how to teach him anything else. Dudley would, if Harry did to him what Harry had just done to Vernon, never speak again. Harry was 9. Harry was, in this 1 minute of his life, very old. He did the arithmetic and he calibrated. Dudley, Harry said, don't. Dudley said, look at me. Don't. Dudley, look at me. Dudley looked. There is a thing that happens in the eyes of a child who is being addressed by a power that has briefly outranked the small private power of his father. The eyes go small. The eyes go round. Dudley's eyes did both. He looked at Harry, and Harry, with the gentle precision of an executioner who has decided to be a teacher instead, made the watching behind his own eyes smaller and softer and shorter. He did not push the full 12 hours of bloodline ocular mercy at Dudley in the way he had pushed the full 72 at Vernon and Petunia. He pushed 12 hours, only 12. And only a particular 12. Not the cupboard, not the starvation, not the worst of the blows, only the small daily nicks of being 5 years old in a schoolyard with a fat cousin who liked every day at break to corner you against the chain link fence behind the lavatories and laugh. "Tsukuyomi," Harry said, very gently. Dudley sat down on the kitchen line. He did not collapse, he did not even cry. His eyes went slack. He sat down with his back against the table leg and stared at a place on the wall about 6 feet above the skirting board, and he did not blink for a long time, and he began very quietly to whisper a string of words that Harry could not at first make out and then with mild horror recognized. "Sorry," Dudley was whispering. "Sorry, sorry, sorry, sorry." Harry sat in the middle of the hall. He looked at the three of them. He felt the watching behind his eyes settling slowly back into the wells they had come from. He felt his own ribs again. He felt the blood drying on his lip. He felt distantly the wall in his mind behind which he had put the pain begin to bow inward. He thought, with the small, dignified clarity of a 9-year-old who has just done something irreversible, that he had probably broken the law. He thought, with the deeper instinct of a 9-year-old who had been broken for 9 years, that he did not, on balance, regret it. He thought, finally, of his mother, of the woman whose hand he had felt on the side of his face for 2 seconds in the warm pressure behind his eyes, and he closed his eyes, and he said, into the empty air of the hallway, in a voice so small it would not have registered on the silver instrument in the stone office in London, "Hello, Mum." Outside on Privet Drive, the milk on the doorstep stood in 3 glass bottles, foil tops glinting. The hedges were perfect. The sky was a flat municipal blue. A magpie crossed the garden once low. From 3 streets away, a dog began to bark and then stopped as if it had thought better of it. In the stone office in London, the small silver instrument rang the second time. The woman behind the desk set down her cup of tea. She had not heard this particular bell ring in 43 years. She stood up. She put on her cloak. She did not run. Madame Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, had not run in 14 years and was not planning to start today. She walked briskly, the way a person walks who knows precisely what kind of thing has happened and what kind of thing must immediately be done about it. She went down the corridor, and she gave 3 quiet orders, and within 7 minutes a team of 4 oars had apparated to a hawthorn hedge 2 streets away from a house on a quiet Surrey cul-de-sac, and were beginning the slow, precise, professional approach of people who had been told, in 3 different ways, to be careful. In the hallway at number 4, the 9-year-old boy sat among his fallen aunts and uncles. And he did not move, and he did not weep, and he watched, behind his own eyes, the inside of a folded paper crane open into the shape of a forest at night with a moon in the wrong place. And he understood, with the calm of a boy to whom nothing further could be done, that the moon was his now, and that what he did with it would be his to decide, and that the deciding had already somewhere begun. He closed his red eyes slowly, the way a curtain comes down. He sat in the dim hush of the hall and listened to the house breathe. The fridge hummed. The kettle Petunia had left on the warmer earlier ticked as the element cooled. A blue bottle hit the kitchen window twice and then gave up. He could hear Vernon's breath in and out, slow, untroubled, the breath of a man whose subjective consciousness had been removed to another time zone entirely. He could hear Petunia's breath, faster, finer, a thin, clean rasp. He could hear Dudley in the kitchen, still whispering sorry against the table leg. Harry very carefully took a breath of his own. It came out wrong on the way in. The 7th rib on the left made itself known. He noted it without flinching, the way one notes the location of a piece of furniture in a dark room one is going to be living in for some time. He shifted his weight off it. He breathed again, shallower. He found the angle. He did not look at his uncle. He looked instead at the small square mirror above the telephone table in the hall. He had not been allowed to look at himself in any of the mirrors of number 4 for nearly a year. Petunia had decided that the boy spent too long looking at his own face, which was a thing she had also accused his mother of, although for different reasons. He looked now. He saw, for the first time, what the watching looked like from outside. The eyes in the mirror were not green anymore. They were the color of an evening sky over a forest in the moment before the moon comes up, which is a color that does not exist in paint and only barely exists in language. Around each pupil, 3 Tomo sat motionless, evenly spaced, perfectly still now that the watching had nothing to do. The black of them was deep. The red around them was deeper. The whites of his eyes, the part that was supposed to be white, were faintly tinged with the same red, like a poured drink seen through a clean glass. He blinked. He watched himself blink. He thought, with a sort of distant scientific courtesy, I will need to learn to make these go away. He thought immediately afterward, I will need to learn how to make them come back. He did not know yet that there was a name for the second eyes, that the 3 Tomo were the surface, the small bright tip of a much older and stranger flowering that had occurred behind them, in the wells that he had felt unlatch under Vernon's hand. He did not know that the inner shape, the one that made the moon, was called Mangekyo, and that those who had inherited it across 900 years of a faraway clan had paid for it always with the death of someone they loved. He did not know that he had paid for it 9 years ago in a small house in a village called Godric's Hollow in a payment that had been completed before he could speak, and that the payment had simply today finished arriving. He knew only that he had a new face. He stood up. The seventh rib protested. He let it protest. He took 3 small careful steps to the cupboard under the stairs and opened the door. He looked for a long quiet moment at the inside of it, at the slatboard where the bent nail was, at the 365 marks, at the corner where Wednesday the spider egg sack had hung patiently for almost a year, at the cot with the thin blanket, at the small pile of broken plastic soldiers Dudley had thrown away in 1986, and which Harry had retrieved one by one from the bin behind the garage and lined up along the edge of the cot like a small honor guard. He looked at all of it, he committed it to memory. He had no available metaphor, yet for why he only knew that he was going to leave this house and that he was going to be a different kind of person when he came back to it if he ever did, and that the small honor guard of broken plastic soldiers had served him faithfully and was owed at least the dignity of being looked at by him one last time with new eyes. He closed the cupboard door. He went into the kitchen. He stepped around Dudley, carefully, the way one steps around a sleeping animal one has elected not to wake. He opened the cupboard above the sink. He took down a clean glass. He filled it from the cold tap. He drank it standing at the sink, 3 small swallows, and it was the most expensive drink of his life because it was the first time in his life he had taken a glass from the cupboard above the sink without first being given permission. He set the glass down very carefully on the draining board. He did not rinse it. He did not feel the need. He looked through the kitchen window into the back garden. The rose bed was perfect. The lawn was a clean, unbroken green. The sun stood at the angle of an early afternoon. A magpie hopped once along the top of the fence and looked at him sidelong and then flew away. He had heard somewhere that magpies were intelligent. He thought briefly that this one had been a witness. From the front step beyond the hedge, he heard the faintest pop of air folding inward on itself. He heard it again. He heard it a third time and a fourth, although the third and fourth were much quieter and considerably more practiced. He understood with a small immediate ease that someone had arrived who knew how to arrive without arriving loudly. He understood further that whatever ringing the second word had set off in the world, it had been heard. He walked back into the hall. He stepped over Vernon's. He sat down with his back against the wall opposite the front door, in the spot where, when he was 4.5, Petunia had once dropped a teacup and not let him go and play until he had picked up every shard, which had taken an hour and 17 minutes. He drew his knees up. He folded his hands neatly in his lap. He arranged his face into the expression he had been wearing for most of his life, which was the expression of a child trying not to be noticed. And then, with a small private deliberateness, he let that expression go and put on his face instead the expression of a child who was prepared to be entirely noticed and had no further opinion about whether this would be a good or a bad thing. He waited. A shadow moved across the frosted glass of the front door. A second shadow joined it. There was a small soft sound like a hand testing the latch, and then the latch turned, and then very politely 3 short knocks. Harry opened his red eyes. "It's open," he said. His voice was steady. "Please come in." The door opened. A woman stood on the step. She was tall, gray-haired, square-shouldered. She wore a long black cloak with the inside lining showing a dark slate blue. She wore a monocle in her right eye. She was unarmed in the way that a person who is most dangerous is unarmed, visibly so, advertised so. Behind her stood 3 other figures in cloaks, 2 flanking her, 1 a half step further back, all of whom had their hands visible and empty, and all of whom were watching Harry with the careful, symmetrical attention of people who had been told before they arrived that the small boy on the floor was not, today, the most ordinary thing in the house. The woman stepped over the threshold. She did not look at Vernon. She did not look at Petunia. She looked at Harry. She regarded him, monocle steady, for 1 full slow second, and then, and only then, after she had measured him and found in him the thing she had come for, she inclined her head perhaps a 1/4 inch. "Mr. Potter," she said. "Yes," said Harry. "My name is Amelia Bones. I am from the magical government. I believe you and I have a great deal to discuss." Harry considered this. He looked at her, through her. He saw with the new sight the steady, deep humming brown and gold current of her chakra moving cleanly through her body, the way a healthy river moves through a healthy bed. He saw, faint at the edges of her, a residue of someone she loved and someone she had lost, and a residue further still of a great many oaths sworn and kept. He saw in her exactly the thing he needed to see, which was that she was not afraid of him. He nodded. "Yes," he said again. "I think we do." He did not at that moment get up. He could not, in fact, have got up. The 7th rib had become quite insistent. He simply sat where he was on the parquet in his cousin's outgrown jumper, with his fallen relations arranged around him like the dramatis personae of a play that had finished its first act, and he waited for the woman with the monocle to step further in, and when she did, he lifted his small chin slightly and let her see his eyes properly and watched her not flinch. The hush in the hallway, which had been Harry's the whole afternoon, expanded to include her. They held it together, the boy and the woman, for the length of one long breath. Then Madame Bones knelt slowly beside him, the way an adult kneels beside a child of equal rank, and she did not touch him because she had been a good enough Auror for long enough to know better than to touch a person whose magic had just rewritten his face, but she did very quietly take off her cloak and lay it across his shoulders. Harry felt the weight of it settle. The lining was warm. He closed his eyes again. The first chapter of his life, the one that had been written by other people in a house he had never chosen, was over. He had not finished the second yet, he had not even begun it. But the page was turning under his hand now, and he could feel it, and the hand on the page was his. Outside, the milk on the doorstep was beginning to warm in the sun. Somewhere 2 streets away, a child laughed. A magpie crossed the back garden a second time, low, and this time it did not stop. Chapter 2, the Tsukuyomi trio. Inside the Tsukuyomi there is no clock. There is instead a sky. The sky is the inside of Harry Potter's mind, and Harry Potter's mind has only recently learned that it possesses a sky at all. And so the sky he has built for his uncle is, like all first cathedrals, a baroque and clumsy and merciless thing, gilded at the apse, scorched at the apex, suspended on a moon that hangs in the wrong place at the wrong angle, throwing its light along the wrong axis, so that all shadows in this country are too long and all faces in it are lit from below. The walls of the sky are not walls. They are arrangements of memory, and the memories are not Harry's. Although they were originally suffered by Harry, they have been pulled out of Vernon's own skull, where they sat in shallow, unmourned heaps under the floorboards of his self-regard, and they have been polished and lit and assembled and hung along the walls of the moon country, and they have been given back to him to look at, one after the other in the new and unforgiving light, for 72 hours. Vernon Dursley, 16 stone of him, blinked into existence at the center of a hallway that was not entirely Privet Drive and not entirely anywhere else. The carpet was Privet Drive's carpet. The wallpaper was Privet Drive's wallpaper. The barometer by the front door was the barometer he had received from his mother in 1973 and had never quite forgiven her for. But the door, when he turned, did not have a door behind it. There was instead a long, soft, watching dark, and the dark had eyes, and the eyes were red. He looked down at himself. This was the first cruelty. He was not himself. He was instead 18 months old in a wicker basket on a doorstep. He could feel the basket against his back. He could feel the cold of the morning through 3 layers of blanket, none of which had been chosen by anyone who knew him. He could feel the weight of an envelope on his chest. He could feel his arms, these tiny, soft, useless arms, twitching against the blanket. He could feel distantly a kind of patient hunger, the way an animal feels weather. He could feel more clearly the impossibly large fact of being alone. He tried to scream. He had a memory of screaming, of how it worked, of the throat grip and air pinch of his adult bellow that had filled this house for 9 years and bent his wife and his son and his nephew around it like reeds. He tried to do it now. He opened the tiny mouth he had been given. He pulled the breath in. He let it out. The sound that came out was not Vernon's, it was Harry's. It was the soft, slightly hoarse, slightly clogged cry of an infant who had been left on a stone step at 3 in the morning in the first week of November, who had been crying for some time before the people inside the house noticed, who was not in any pain except the small biological pain of having a body that wanted milk and a body that wanted warmth and a body that more than anything wanted to be held. The door of the house opened. Petunia Dursley looked down at him. Vernon, within Harry, saw Petunia's face from below. He saw with terrible clarity the small, mean, particular tightening of her mouth at the corner, the kind of tightening that one's wife develops only after one has lived with her long enough to know that the tightening is reserved for the smell of a meal she did not order, the arrival of a relation she did not invite, the sight of a baby who is not hers. He had never seen the tightening on her face before because he had been the wrong person to receive it. He was now the right person. He felt the tightening land. He understood in the precise way that the inside of the Tsukuyomi makes one understand a thing one had already known, that he had married a woman who was capable of looking at a child on her own doorstep with that exact tightening, and that he had loved her without ever looking at it, and that the tightening had been there in her all along, and that he had been a fool not to see it. The understanding arrived through his 18-month-old eyes with no anesthetic. The door closed. He was carried briefly. The hallway opened beneath him. A cupboard door opened. The cupboard smelled of dust and floor cleaner. The cupboard was tiny. The cupboard was a tomb shaped like a coffin, shaped like a stairwell. He was set down on a cot. The blanket was pulled up over him. The cupboard door closed. He was alone in the dark. Time moved. Time moves in the Tsukuyomi exactly as fast as the architect of the country decides it should move. Harry had been merciful with his uncle in one regard only. He had compressed the first 6 years of his own life into one subjective night, so that Vernon did not have to live them in the slow, real-time grain. The cupboard instead became an accelerated weather. Vernon inside Harry felt himself age inside the cupboard. He felt the small body lengthen awkwardly the way a sapling lengthens under bad light. He felt the small body grow hungry. He felt the small body learn to be quiet. He felt the small body learn the particular trick of breathing without making sound, and of weeping without making sound, and of asking for nothing without making sound, and of being nothing without making sound. He felt the small body learn what the cupboard taught, which was that the world was not on his side, and that the smaller he made himself, the longer the world would let him live. He felt also the small body learn the cold. The cold of the cupboard was not the cold of an English winter. It was the cold of being deliberately uncalorically heated. Vernon had for 9 years set the thermostat in the hall at 15 degrees Celsius, a notch lower than was decent, and had told himself that this was thrift. He had not until tonight considered what that one notch felt like at 4 in the morning, in a cupboard, in a jumper that had been Dudley's 2 winters ago and was already too thin, with no blanket because the blanket had been taken away on Tuesday for spilling, with no shoes because the shoes had been taken away yesterday for muddying. He felt the one notch now. He felt it in the small bones of his shins. He felt it in the small joints of his fingers. He felt it in the small high arch of his soft, fast baby ribs, which the cold rendered audible to him like a piano with the lid open. He had not known until tonight that a child's ribs in the cold could be heard from the inside. He heard them now. He heard them for hours. The hours were not real hours. The hours were Vernon's hours, and the country he was in did not let him out of them. Time moved. The cupboard expanded into a series of cupboards. The cupboards expanded into school. The school was full of small children, and small children by some terrible elective principle knew. They knew the way crows know. They saw the jumper and the bruise and the bent posture and the failure to make eye contact, and they organized around it, and they made it the center of their gravity. Vernon felt himself in Harry's body, standing at the edge of a playground in 1985 and watching 23 of his peers move toward him in a slow, tightening half-circle. He felt the precise location of the chain-link fence against his shoulder blades. He felt the precise temperature of the urine that ran down his own leg when, at 6.5, in the moment the half-circle closed, he discovered that he was not going to be able to control his bladder this time either. He felt with the inside that Tsukuyomi clarity the precise small ringing humiliation that had echoed through Harry on the bus home that afternoon as the trousers dried. He felt then the door of number 4 open. He saw Petunia from below. He saw her see him. He felt the slap. It came across the side of the face open-handed. It was not Vernon's slap, it was Petunia's. He had never noticed in 9 years that his wife slapped his nephew. He had assumed vaguely that the slapping was his department. It was not. It had been a fully distributed enterprise, and Petunia had been carrying her share. The slap arrived inside Vernon and lit, behind his 18-month eyes, an entire genealogy of small daily slaps he had not seen, did not want to see, and was now obliged to receive in chronological order 1 a second for 12 subjective hours. He counted. He could not help counting. There were, by the end of the 12 hours, 843 slaps. They were not heavy. They were not, on any individual scale, dangerous. They had been individually what Petunia called a tap to remind him. Vernon had never asked what the boy needed to be reminded of. Inside Harry now he understood. He was being reminded 843 times over 6 years that he was small. He was being reminded that he could be touched without consent. He was being reminded that the woman in the house who was supposed to be the safe one was, in fact, in her own quiet way, also the unsafe one. By tap 843, Vernon could no longer tell the difference between the inside of his cheek and the wallpaper of the hall. He understood that this was the point. He wept. He wept inside the 18-month-old body. The tears were Harry's tears, and they were also his, and they did not stop. He aged. He aged inside the country. He felt his 7th birthday. There was no cake. There was no card. There was a letter from his school class that his teacher had made the class write, 26 small letters of polite congratulation, that Petunia had intercepted at the door, read with the corner of the mouth tightening and thrown into the kitchen bin, and that he had retrieved from the kitchen bin at midnight with his hands in the cold coffee grounds, and had read by the street lamp through the kitchen window, and had memorized in their entirety. 26 small letters of polite congratulation that he had never been allowed to answer. Vernon inside Harry retrieved the letters now. He read them. He wept again. He understood with terrible specificity that he had personally been the one who, on the morning of the boy's 7th birthday, had complained loudly at the breakfast table about the noise of the post coming through the letterbox. Because there had been a great deal of it that day, 26 envelopes from a class of small children who had liked the small boy in their room with the green eyes and the quiet voice in the way of sharing his pencil. 26 envelopes, all of which Petunia had thrown out. He had not seen her throw them out. He had complained about the noise of them coming in. This was, he understood, the architecture of the country. The country was constructed of small things, and the small things were arranged so that each one was a thread in a fabric, and the fabric was a curtain, and the curtain was the whole inside of his life. He had not seen the curtain before, he saw it now. He could not stop seeing it. He felt himself broken in the Tsukuyomi at approximately Tsukuyomi hour 31. By this measure, he had endured the equivalent of 11 subjective years inside the boy, accelerated and condensed, but in no way muted. He had felt by then 3,000 discrete cruelties, of which he was the author of 1,104. He had felt also 2 cruelties he had personally never inflicted but which Petunia had inflicted and which he had been told about over dinner and had laughed at over dinner and which by his laughter he had endorsed and which were now therefore his. He sat down in the country. The country kindly gave him a chair. The chair was the chair he kept by the back garden door at home, the wicker one, the one Petunia had repainted last summer. He sat on it. He looked up. The moon hung in the wrong place. The eyes in the dark were watching, but the eyes were not cruel. The eyes, he understood for the first time, were a child's. They were a child's eyes that had been forced to learn very quickly how to be an adult's eyes. They were sorry he had to see this. They were not sorry he was seeing it. Vernon began to apologize. He apologized at first in the way a man apologizes when he has just lost an argument and intends to win the next one. The country did not accept the apology. The country waited. He apologized again more carefully. The country waited. He apologized a third time, more carefully still. And as he did so, the apology began to change shape inside him, and he found himself in the middle of the third apology weeping again, and then he found himself in the middle of the third apology on his knees, and then he found himself in the middle of the third apology prostrate in the soft inside the country grass, with his forehead pressed to a cold he had not previously known existed. The cold of an English doorstep in November at 3 in the morning. He understood, finally, that the apology he was attempting to deliver was not the right apology. The right apology was much, much smaller. The right apology was the small, unspeaking apology of putting his arms out with no condition attached to them and letting the small alone basket be placed in them and saying nothing further at all. He held out his arms. The basket did not arrive. The country kindly withheld it. The country, he understood, did not have it to give. The basket had been taken 9 years ago by a different doorstep, and he had been on the wrong side of that doorstep, and the basket had been refused. The country could not give him the chance to do it again. The country could only give him the full and unmuted understanding that he had refused it once, and that the refusal could not be undone. He fell forward, his forehead touched the grass. He stayed that way for by inside the country measurement the next 36 hours. He did not move. He did not sleep. Sleep was not on offer here. He simply lay in the grass with the small posture of a man who had finally, in a country he could not leave, understood the precise shape of the thing he had spent his life refusing to see, and the eyes in the dark watched him, and the moon in the wrong place did not move. At hour 72, the country dissolved. He returned to his body in the hallway of number 4 exactly 3 real-world seconds after he had left it. He had aged in the country by some calendar that has no name in English. His hair did not turn white, his eyes did not change color. His soul, however, which had been a hot, small, loud, certain thing for 53 years, had been removed, examined, washed, dried, and put back in a slightly different orientation, and would now for the rest of its tenancy in the body of Vernon Dursley hum at the wrong frequency for the body around it in a small, constant, private dissonance that the body could not house. This was why he collapsed. Petunia, in her own country, had a different journey. Harry, with the curatorial precision of a librarian who is also the author and also the executioner, had built her a different sky. Her sky was a kitchen. The kitchen was the kitchen of 1973 at Cokeworth, with the linoleum still the original yellow and the back door still hanging slightly off the lower hinge. The kitchen had Lily in it. Lily was 11. Lily had just come home from her first year at Hogwarts and was sitting at the table peeling an apple with a small bone-handled knife. And Petunia in her own 12-year-old body in the kitchen of 1973 was standing in the doorway, and Lily was looking up at her with the small, uncomplicated smile that small sisters give big sisters who they have missed for 10 months and have not yet learned to fear. Petunia inside the country did not move. This was the architecture of her sky. Harry had built it like a hall of mirrors. Every cruelty Petunia had inflicted on him in 9 years would be reflected back at her, but it would be reflected back through Lily, through the precise face of the sister she had decided to hate in order to survive having loved her, and every time Petunia raised her hand, she would raise it not against the small green-eyed boy in his cousin's jumper but against the small green-eyed girl at her kitchen table peeling an apple. Every slap she had ever delivered to Harry would land on Lily. Every time she had thrown out a piece of his post, she would throw out a piece of Lily's post. Every freak she had hissed at her nephew, she would hiss at her sister. Petunia, who had spent 47 years building a fortress around the place in herself where Lily had once lived, found that the fortress had been removed. There was in her only the place. The place was raw. The place was 11 years old. The place was holding an apple in her own hand, watching her sister peel one at the table, and feeling with a clarity that knocked her down inside the country in the first 10 seconds, the truth she had spent her whole life hiding from, which was that she had loved her sister, that she had loved her sister with an unanswered and unspeakable intensity for the entire decade between 5 and 15, that the love had been the central organizing fact of her childhood. And that the hatred she had built on top of it after Lily was sorted at Hogwarts, and Petunia was not had been a thin and elegantly painted ceiling over a room that was structurally made of love. The room was the room. The ceiling was a lie. She had been living above the ceiling and pretending the room did not exist. And now the ceiling was gone and the room was visible and the room was full of all the love she had refused to admit she still had. And the room was also full of a small boy with green eyes whose eyes were Lily's eyes and whose face was Lily's face and whose existence, she finally understood, had been intolerable to her for precisely one reason, that he had survived and Lily had not, and that this had felt to her like a kind of victory by her sister, and she had punished the boy daily for 9 years for the sin of being the proof of her sister's last act of love. She broke at the 8-minute mark of the inside the country time. She broke completely. What followed for her then was not punishment. Petunia inside the country was not made to relive Harry's cupboard or the slaps or the cold with the granular slow detail that Vernon had been. Harry, with a precision he did not entirely understand and would later, with serious, sit and discuss for hours, had built Petunia's country to do a different thing. He had built Petunia's country to let her, for the first time in her life, hold her sister. Lily came around the kitchen table. Lily put down the apple. Lily came and stood in front of her 12-year-old sister in the linoleum kitchen and looked at her with the small, uncomplicated face of an 11-year-old who had missed her sister for 10 months and did not yet know that she would be hated for it. Lily put her arms up. Lily in the country was already as tall as Petunia. Lily put her arms around her sister. Lily held her. Petunia in the country held her back. She held her sister for 72 hours. The country kindly did not let her go. She wept for the first 6 hours, hard, the deep, blocked, knotted weep of a person who has been refusing to weep for 35 years. She wept until the small sob mechanism in her diaphragm gave out and she could only make a thin, hoarse, breathing sound. Then she wept differently, softer, slower, the weep of a sister at the funeral of a sister, 10 years too late, in a kitchen that no longer existed, in arms that did not actually belong to her. Then she stopped weeping after about 30 hours of country time and she simply held on and Lily held her and Lily did not speak, and the moon in the country hung in the wrong place and the eyes in the dark were watching and the eyes in the dark were Harry's and the eyes in the dark by hour 40 were no longer angry, only present, only patient, only watching to make sure that Petunia did not let go before the country had finished doing its work. At hour 68 Lily in the country spoke. She said only 4 words. She said, "I missed you too." At hour 72 the country dissolved. Petunia returned to her body in the hallway of number 4 exactly 3 real-world seconds after Vernon had returned to his. She did not collapse all at once. She sat down with her knees folded against the wall. She let go of the tea towel. She looked at nothing. She was not catatonic in the sense that an orer later in the day would mistakenly use the word. She was, more accurately, full. She was so full of a love that had been 47 years damned that she had no remaining bandwidth to operate the muscles of the face, or the speech apparatus, or the voluntary motor system. She would, in time, become operable again. She would, in fact, become a different person, and would in 22 years be permitted by the senior healer at the Janus Thickey ward to write a single letter in her own hand to Harry James Potter, age 31, in which she would say 6 things, none of which had ever been said to him in the house in which she had raised him, and one of which would make him sit down on a stone bench in a garden in Wales and weep, for the first time in many years, in a way that did not embarrass him. That, however, is a country one travels by living. This is a country one travels by Tsukuyomi. Dudley was the smallest country. Harry had calibrated him to 12 hours. Inside, Dudley found himself behind the lavatories at his primary school. He was 9. He was thin, he was small. He was wearing a jumper 3 sizes too large. He was leaning against the chain-link fence. The chain-link fence was cold. Around him, in a slow tightening half-circle, were 5 boys, and the boys were laughing, and the laughter had the small, particular, hostile, mucus-edged tone of children who have organized into a temporary parliament for the purpose of ruining one of their own. The 5 boys were not Dudley's friends. Dudley did not have friends in this country. Dudley had in this country only the 5 boys and the chain-link fence at his back and the small bright knowledge that one of the 5 boys was in fact his cousin, was in fact the same fat, cheerful, red-faced cousin who in another life had taught him by example that this was the correct way to spend a Tuesday at break. Dudley and Harry did not understand at first what was happening. He looked down at himself. He saw the small, thin body. He saw the small, thin arms. He saw the bruise on the wrist where his cousin, the other cousin, the one who in this country had brought the boys here, had grabbed him an hour ago. He looked up at the boys. He looked at the boy in the middle. The boy in the middle had a familiar face. The face was the face of Dudley himself at 9 at his glandular peak, with his small red mouth and his small mean grin and his small enormous untroubled certainty that the small thin cousin at the fence was, by some natural law of the universe, his to torment. Dudley and Harry at the chain-link fence watched himself laugh. Then his other self stepped forward and the half-circle closed, and the next 12 country hours of Dudley Dursley's subjective life consisted of being on the receiving end of an unbroken series of small daily schoolyard humiliations of the kind that Dudley, the real Dudley, had inflicted on his cousin for 4 years, but compressed and ordered chronologically and rendered in the inside that Tsukuyomi register of full sensory detail. He was hit. He was tripped. His packed lunch was taken. His glasses, which in this country he was wearing because Harry was wearing them, were taken and snapped in half. His shoes were taken. He had to walk home in October in his socks. The socks went through. His feet bled. He was hit again by the same 5 boys the next day at the gate before he could get inside. He was hit again the day after that. He was at one point picked up by the collar by the fat boy in the middle and held against the wall behind the lavatories and slowly, deliberately for laughs, head butted in the face. His nose did not break. The fat boy in the middle laughed. The other 4 boys laughed. Dudley and Harry against the wall did not laugh. By country hour 8, Dudley had stopped crying. He had not stopped weeping. He was still weeping in the small private way that the body weeps after the loud public way has been beaten out of it. He had simply stopped crying. He had also stopped speaking. He had also stopped looking up. He had begun by hour 8 doing a thing he had never done in his 9 real years of life. He had begun against the chain-link fence to count the small daily cruelties. He had begun to count them out loud in a whisper that did not carry to the other side of the playground. He counted in the order they had happened, and he did not stop counting until country hour 11, by which time he had reached 371. At country hour 11, Harry, author and architect and small, distant, merciful executor, did something for Dudley that he had not done for Vernon or Petunia. He stepped briefly into Dudley's country in person. He did not appear as a fat, happy cousin. He did not appear as the fat, happy cousin's victim either. He appeared instead as he was now, 9 narrow in his cousin's outgrown jumper with red eyes and 3 tomo in each, standing on the playground tarmac about 10 feet from the chain-link fence. He looked at Dudley. Dudley in the small, thin body looked up at him. Harry in the country said one sentence. He said, "I forgive you in advance for the next 2 years. I do not forgive you for the 11 years before that. You will have to do that yourself." Then Harry stepped back, and the country dissolved at hour 12, and Dudley returned to his body in the kitchen at number 4, sitting against the table leg, with his back to the line, whispering sorry against the wood. He did not know yet what he was sorry for exactly. He only knew, with a certainty he had never previously held in his 9 years of life, that he was sorry, and that the sorry was the most accurate thing he had ever felt, and that the sorry was additionally the first sentence of his actual life. In the hallway, 3 real-world seconds had passed since Harry had cast Tsukuyomi the 3rd time. Vernon was on the floor. Petunia was on the floor. Dudley was sitting against the kitchen table leg, whispering. Harry was sitting up with blood on his lip, with the watching of his new eyes settling back into the wells where it was made, and he was in the small particular way of a child who has just done the largest thing he has ever done by a factor of 1,000, looking down at the carpet and breathing and thinking very calmly that perhaps he had better sit down. He sat down. He let the 7th rib do its work. He waited in the silence after, for the country he had built to dissolve fully, the way one waits for a thunderhead one has summoned to leave the field. A footnote about Vernon's country. The one mercy Harry had built into it without entirely knowing he was building it had been the small, unobtrusive presence of a basket. Throughout the 72 hours, in the corner of every memory, there had been a wicker basket. It had not always been visible. Sometimes it was a wicker laundry hamper at the foot of a staircase. Sometimes it was a wicker fruit bowl on a kitchen counter. Sometimes it was the wicker chair Petunia had repainted in 1985. The basket was the same basket. It was the basket in which Vernon, on the doorstep, had refused to lift the infant into his house. The basket appeared faintly at the corner of every cruelty, as a kind of small, persistent reminder that the cruelty had begun there, on that doorstep with that basket, and that none of what followed could be untangled from that first refusal. Vernon, by hour 40, had learned to look for the basket in every memory before he looked at anything else. By hour 50, he had begun to talk to it, short, small, unembellished sentences of apology that he did not direct at anyone in particular, the way a man at a graveside talks to the grass. By hour 60, the basket had begun, very slightly, to feel less like an indictment and more like a witness. He found near the end that he was grateful to it. He did not know why. He suspected vaguely that someone, the boy in the dark, the eyes with the moon behind them, had put it there on purpose as a small private gift so that the 72 hours would not be only punishment, would also be in some unspoken way a chance to begin to mourn. This was the second cruelty, that the gift given by the nephew was the only kindness Vernon had been shown in the country, and that the nephew was the one he had spent 9 years refusing to love. He did not in the country miss this. He saw it. He could not stop seeing it. By hour 71 he had, behind his prostration in the cold grass, begun a very small private theology of his own ruin, in which the boy at the door was a kind of angel of accounting, and the accounting was a kind of grace, and the grace was the kind that, having been refused, could not be reoffered and could only at this late stage be acknowledged. He acknowledged. He acknowledged for an entire subjective hour. He did not stop until the country let him stop. A footnote about Petunia's country. It contained, in the kitchen of 1973, on the windowsill above the sink, a small object that did not, strictly speaking, belong there in real life. It was a paper crane. It was folded out of yellowed newsprint. It sat on the windowsill in the country for the entire 72 hours, and Petunia, in the country in her sister's arms, found her eyes drawn to it in the small, slow intervals between her weeping. She knew the crane. She had not seen it since she was 9, when her grandmother Akimi, the Japanese witch she was not supposed to know about, the witch whose existence the family had labored to forget, had folded it for her on a Sunday afternoon and given it to her, and had told her, in a voice that did not match any other voice in her childhood, that the crane would always be where she needed it to be. Petunia had hidden the crane in a tin under her bed for 2 years, and then, after Lily had received her Hogwarts letter and Petunia had decided that there were too many magical objects in her life and that she would have to eliminate them in order to survive, she had thrown the crane out. The crane was on the windowsill in the country. The country had brought it back. The country, in giving it back, was telling her, and the telling was without words, was simply the presence of the crane on the sill, that the grandmother had been right. The crane was today where she needed it to be. Petunia held her sister and looked at the crane, and understood that the crane had been folded out of the same paper as the small living country she now sat in, and that the country was a crane, and the crane was a country, and the country was a forgiveness she was finally being given the chance to receive, not from her sister who was beyond her reach, but from her own grandmother posthumously by way of her nephew who had inherited the gift and was now, in the way that 9-year-olds inherit things they cannot understand, deploying it correctly. She wept again at hour 52 when she understood this. The weeping at hour 52 was different from the weeping at the beginning. It was the weeping of a person who has just understood that the family she belonged to was much, much larger than the family she had agreed to live with, and that she had, in living with the smaller one, betrayed the larger one. She wept for the larger one. The larger one held her too. A footnote about Dudley's country. At the end of his 12 country hours after Harry had stepped in and delivered the one-sentence absolution that was also an indictment, Dudley sat against the chain-link fence for what felt like a long, quiet minute and looked at his own hands. The hands were thin. The hands were small. The hands were Harry's. He turned them over. He looked at the palms. He looked at the lines on the palms. He did not know how to read palm lines, but he understood by some unspoken inside the country instinct that the lines on a child's palm are determined by the inside of the world the child is given, and that the lines on these palms had been determined by him. He had not given his cousin the world. He had been one of the people who had narrowed it. The narrowness was visible in the lines. He looked at the narrowness for a long minute. Then he closed the hands into small fists. Gently, the way a person closes the eyes of someone they have decided to forgive in advance, and he held them closed until the country dissolved. He sat against the kitchen table leg in the real world for some time after, with the small new awareness inside him that he had been given a debt and that he had been given 2 years in which to begin to pay it. He did not yet know how he would pay it. He knew only that the paying had begun and that the first installment today would be saying sorry, saying it specifically to his cousin, saying it without expecting absolution, saying it as a small statement of fact about the shape of his life from now on. The hallway of number 4 held all of this. The hallway did not move. The clock on the wall above the telephone table ticked through the 3 real-world seconds in which 72 subjective hours of Vernon's life, 72 subjective hours of Petunia's life, and 12 subjective hours of Dudley's life had taken place. The clock ticked once, twice, 3 times, and the lives were rewritten and the clock kept ticking. The clock did not know, Harry knew. Harry, sitting cross-legged on the parquet of the hall, with his hands neatly folded in his lap, in his cousin's outgrown jumper with blood drying on his lip and a cracked rib beginning to call attention to itself, watched the small invisible cargo of 72 plus 72 plus 12 subjective hours settle into the 3 bodies he had altered. He saw it settle. He saw behind his new eyes the slow softening of the chakra of his uncle, less swampish now, less hollow at the gut, ringing a different note that the body would not ultimately be able to host. The brightening, and that was the word, the actual word of the chakra of his aunt, a chamber unbarred, a window cracked open. A small, high, clean note that had not sounded in her for 47 years now sounding faintly and steadily through her whole body. And the sad, small reorientation of the chakra of his cousin, the bullying current, the small, fat, ungenerous current that had run through Dudley from age 4, was being slowly, patiently, internally rerouted. And Harry watched the routing for a long minute with the gentle attentiveness of a boy watching a stream change its course around a stone. He thought distantly about his mother again. She had been there in the air to his left for 2 seconds with her hand at the side of his face. She had not, since the watching settled, been back. He thought with the precise, unembellished clarity of a child who has decided to be honest with himself about a wish that cannot be granted, that he would have liked her to come back. He thought with the same clarity that she would not. He thought finally that he had seen her, and that the seeing of her had been a kind of 72 plus 12 subjective hours of his own, compressed into 2 seconds, in which he had finally been permitted to know what it would have felt like to be held by someone who actually wanted to hold him. He did not weep. He had not wept in 2 years. He understood that weeping was a thing one did when one believed someone would come if one wept loud enough, and that he had stopped believing this at 7.5, and that the new eyes had not given him back the believing. The new eyes had given him, instead, something else. The new eyes had given him a country he could build and unbuild and visit other people inside, and the country was, on balance, the better gift. He preferred it. He would, in the years to come, sometimes regret preferring it. He would not, on balance, change his preference. Outside, the milk was beginning to warm in the sun. A magpie was preparing to cross the back garden for the second time. In a stone office in London, a small silver instrument had rung twice and was now gently ringing for the third. Chapter 3. The Aurors arrived. The interesting question, from the perspective of Madame Amelia Bones, was not what had happened in the hallway of number 4 Privet Drive. The interesting question was what had to be true for what had happened to have been possible. This was the kind of question Madame Bones tended to put first when she walked into a scene. It was not the question her younger Aurors put first. Her younger Aurors put obvious questions first. What is this? Who did this? Where is the wand? Where is the body? Where is the perpetrator? These were good questions. They were not, however, the first questions. The first question, always in any investigation that mattered, was the structural question. What does the world have to look like for this to be a thing I am looking at? Because once you knew the answer to the structural question, you knew in advance where to look for the rest. Madame Bones had been kneeling next to the boy for 37 seconds. She had laid her cloak across his shoulders. She had not touched him. She had asked his name, and he had given it, and the giving had been calm and unblinking and structurally extraordinary. The first thing the structural question told her, looking at this boy, was that whatever else was true in this house, this 9-year-old was the most magically significant individual in it by a margin of approximately 3 orders of magnitude. The second thing the structural question told her was that he was injured, and the injuries were not new, and the injuries were not from magic. The third thing the structural question told her, and this was the part that made her very briefly want to break a wand across her own knee in pure professional shame, was that the injuries had been catalogued by the magical government she ran for approximately 7 years in a memorandum she had personally signed off on, which had used the word adequate in the conclusion. She did not let any of this show in her face. "Mr. Potter," she said, "may I ask you a question?" "Yes." "Did you cast a spell today on these 3 people?" Harry considered this. The consideration was visible. He was, she noted, the kind of child who actually thought before speaking, a thing that statistically perhaps 3% of 9-year-olds did, and most of those did it only because they had been threatened into doing it. He was not, she noted further, threatened. He was simply considering. "I do not know if it was a spell. What do you call it? Tsukuyomi?" Madame Bones nodded as if the word were ordinary. It was not ordinary. The word was not, to her professional knowledge, in any spellbook, in any library, in any wizarding nation in Europe. It might be in a spellbook in a library in a wizarding nation outside Europe. She would have to send an owl. She filed the word in the precise small mental drawer where she filed unknown nouns of obvious importance, and she carried on. "And what does Tsukuyomi do, Mr. Potter?" Harry considered again. He looked briefly at his uncle on the floor and at his aunt against the wall and at his cousin in the kitchen doorway. He looked back at her. "It puts a person inside a country of their own memories," he said. "For as long as I tell it to, they feel everything. I felt everything when I learned how to do it. I made my uncle and my aunt feel 72 hours. I gave my cousin 12 hours. My cousin is a child. The 72 would have been too much. There was a small soft sound from one of the Aurors behind her. She did not turn, she knew the sound. It was the sound a trained Auror makes when they hear from a 9-year-old a sentence that they themselves would not have constructed at 30. Mr. Potter, she said carefully, when you say a country of their memories, do you mean their memories generally or specific memories? Specific. Which? The cruelties they had committed against me, from my perspective. Madame Bones was quiet for 2 seconds. The 2 seconds were the longest silence in the hall since she had entered it. In the 2 seconds she ran, internally, 3 calculations. The first calculation was legal. Was what the boy had just described a crime? The answer was complicated. There were 11 separate provisions of the International Statute of Magical Wand Use that could, theoretically, be invoked. None of them, however, had been written with this particular kind of action in mind. The standard tests, wand use, age of caster, presence of intent to harm, presence of provocation, presence of unbroken statute, gave answers that were either inapplicable, irrelevant, or, in 2 key cases, exculpatory. In particular, the boy had not used a wand. The trace, therefore, would not have triggered on him. The thing that had triggered instead was the older instrument in her office, the one that responded to certain ancient bloodline signatures, the one she had not heard ring in 43 years. The legal status of what the bloodline instrument had picked up was, to her professional knowledge, untested. She filed this. Untested meant the trial, when it came, would be hers to shape. Untested meant precedent would be set today and she would be the one setting it. Untested meant she had to be careful because what she did now would still be doctrine in 50 years. The second calculation was investigative. Was what the boy had just described consistent with the physical evidence in the room? She let her eyes move without turning her head. Vernon Dursley on the floor was breathing. He was not, as a younger Auror might have hastily concluded, dead. He was alive. He was, however, gibbering. There was a small, steady tremor at the corner of his mouth, and his eyes, when she had glanced at them on entering, were open, were not seeing, and were tracking, very slowly, some object in the middle distance that was not in this hallway. Petunia Dursley, against the wall, was also breathing. She was not gibbering. She was instead weeping with such complete quiet that one had to look at the visible track on the cheek to know that the weeping was occurring. The boy Dudley in the kitchen was whispering. The whisper, when she tuned her ear, was the word sorry repeated. None of the 3 were in any conventional sense conscious. None of the 3 showed signs of magical injury to the body. None of the 3 showed signs of mind rape or compulsion in the standard signatures her trained Aurors could detect by passive sweep. They had all 3 been altered. She did not have yet the vocabulary for the alteration. She had, however, a working hypothesis. Her working hypothesis matched the boy's description. The third calculation was personal. Was the boy lying? She watched him very carefully while he sat with her cloak around his shoulders. She watched his hands. She watched the angle of his head. She watched the small involuntary fluctuations in his breath. She watched, with the particular trained sight of a person who has interviewed 1,100 witnesses in 22 years of service, for the small specific tics of a child trying out a story. She did not see them. What she saw instead was a 9-year-old who was sitting calmly because he had run out of other available postures, who was answering her questions accurately because he had no better strategy left, and who was looking at her with red eyes that, every time she looked into them properly, registered behind them the steady, patient flicker of something that was both ancient and unfinished. The boy was not lying. The boy was also not quite a boy, she decided. She decided in the 3rd second of her silence. She had not in 22 years decided this fast on something this large, but she had been in 22 years training the muscle that allowed her to. Mr. Potter, she said, I am going to do several things in the next half hour and I would like you to know what they are. Is that all right with you? He looked at her. Yes. I am going to ask my Auror Tonks, the one with the red hair, to step into the hallway and place your uncle in a stasis. She will not hurt him. The stasis is so that whatever is going on inside him does not deteriorate further before we have a healer here. I am going to ask my Auror Robards to do the same for your aunt. I am going to ask my Auror Williamson to attend to your cousin. They are children themselves, all 3 in the relevant senses, and they have been trained for this. Is that all right? Yes. I am, with your permission, going to call a healer to examine you. I am told by my eyes that you have a broken rib, possibly 2. I would like that seen too. 3, said Harry mildly. She blinked. It was the only break in her composure she had allowed since the front step. 3, the 7th and 9th on the left, said Harry, and the 4th on the right, but I think that one is only cracked, not fully through. I can hear them when I breathe. The 7th is the one that moved when he kicked me. The others were earlier. Madame Bones nodded very slowly. She had not asked which uncle. She had not had to. All right, she said. 3, we will see to all 3. I will be next to you the whole time unless you tell me otherwise. Is there anything you want me to do first before I do any of those things? Yes. What? Harry looked at her with the red eyes, with the watching settled into the wells of them. He spoke without any tremor. Send someone to the cupboard under the stairs, he said. There is a small pile of broken plastic soldiers in there. They are mine. I would like to keep them. Madame Bones did not in the moment do anything visible with her face. She did, however, allow herself, privately, internally in the small inner office of her own selfhood, to feel a precise, cold, professional anger of a kind she had felt only 7 times in her life. Each of the previous 6 times had been followed by a sustained and effective campaign of investigation that had ended in 5 out of 6 cases with the relevant perpetrator stripped of wand, vault, and citizenship. The 7th she was beginning now. She straightened. She turned her head very slightly. She did not raise her voice. "Tonks," she said. The pink-haired witch beside her, who had been standing without moving for approximately 97 seconds, said, "Yes, ma'am. I want the contents of the cupboard under the stairs in this house catalogued, photographed, and removed to evidence. I want it done by you personally. I want every object inside that cupboard placed in its own labeled box. I want the boxes to remain together. Mr. Potter has informed me that there are a number of small plastic soldiers in there which are his personal property and which he would like to retain. I would like you to ensure that those in particular are not lost." "Yes, ma'am." "Robards, ma'am, stasis on the man, stasis on the woman. I do not want either of them transported to St. Mungo's until I have personally examined the contents of their minds. The boy in the kitchen, Williamson, please, is to be treated as a non-suspect witness. He is 9, he is a child. I want him moved gently to the sitting room and a calming draft offered. I want no one to address him as anything other than Mr. Dursley. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," said Williamson, who did not look at the boy on the kitchen lino in any way other than the way one looks at a wounded child. "Orr Selwyn, you will apparate now to St. Mungo's and bring back Healer Madison and the duty mind healer on rotation. Tell them what you saw on arrival and only what you saw. Do not speculate, do not embellish. Do not under any circumstances mention the word Sheringham. We do not have the right to use that word until we know more." "Ma'am," said Selwyn, who had not previously heard the word Sheringham in his life and was not certain he had heard it now but was certain that he was not going to repeat it. Now, 4 pops of apparition. Tonks went up the hall toward the cupboard. Robards bent over Vernon. Williamson bent slowly, gently, with the small care of a man who has children of his own, toward Dudley and said in a low and careful voice, "Dudley, my name is Robert. Can I help you up? Would you like a glass of water?" Dudley looked at him. Dudley nodded. Dudley let himself be helped up. The whispering did not stop, but it became, in being moved, a little quieter. Madame Bones returned her full attention to Harry. "Mr. Potter." "Yes, I would like to ask you one more question before the healer arrives. You may answer it or you may decline. Both are acceptable answers." "All right, what is the eldest age at which you remember being struck by your uncle?" Harry considered. "Today, and the youngest?" 4. She did not move, she did not nod, she did not blink. She allowed herself again the small, private, cold, professional registering. 5 years. 5 years of magical government records had described this household as settled and adequate, and discouraged from but not actively prohibited from corporal correction within reasonable limits. 5 years. She would in a fortnight sign the formal recommendation that resulted in 2 members of her department being removed, that resulted in the entire Squib Liaison and Muggle Placement Subcommittee being restructured, and that resulted in the inquiry, known internally for many years afterward as the Bones Audit, into 17 other Muggle placements of magical children. 3 of those 17 would prove on examination to be approximately as bad as number 4, Privet Drive. 2 of them would be remediable. 1 of them would be too late. She would carry that one, the too late one, in a small dark place in her professional self for the remaining years of her career, and would, on the day she retired, walk into the office of the Wisengamot Library archivist and personally refile the relevant case folder under a different shelf mark so that it could not be lost again. For now, in the hallway, she looked at Harry and she made one further internal decision. She would not this afternoon ask him for any more of the structural facts. She would instead give him 3 small things: a healer, a meal, and a piece of paper. "Mr. Potter?" "Yes, ma'am. There is going to be a great deal of work to do today and tomorrow and the next several weeks. Some of it will be tiring and some of it will be invasive, and I will do my best to make it as small as I can. While we wait for the healer, I would like to do 3 things. May I?" "Yes. First, may I see your hand?" He held out his right hand. It was small, dirty under the nails, and shaking very faintly, the small fine tremor of a body whose adrenaline was beginning finally to ebb. Madame Bones took it. Her own hand was large and dry and warm. She did not press, she simply held it. She held it for the length of one full breath. "Thank you," she said. "Second, are you hungry?" He considered. "I am thirsty." "Then water is what we will get. Williamson, when you're next out, ask the kitchen for 2 glasses of cold water, no ice." "Ma'am." Third, Madame Bones reached into the inside pocket of her cloak, the cloak that was currently around Harry's shoulders, with the practiced reach of a person who had once put something in there and now wished to take it out. She withdrew a small square of folded parchment. She unfolded it. It was, Harry could see, a printed form with a seal at the top, a small silver griffin holding a balance. The parchment was, despite being parchment, almost weightless. This, said Madame Bones, is a statement of magical guardianship form. It is the form that determines in the next 24 hours where you will be placed, who will be responsible for you, and who will speak for you in court if it comes to court, which I believe it will. The standard form for an underage wizard requires the consent of the most recent named magical guardian. In your case, the most recent named magical guardian is your great uncle Alfred Black, who is dead. The next named is your godfather, Sirius Orion Black, who is, and I will speak honestly with you, Mr. Potter, because I think you are a person who is owed honesty, currently incarcerated in Azkaban for a crime which, on the basis of certain evidence I will be reviewing tomorrow morning, I am not confident he actually committed. Harry's eyes did not widen. He looked at her steadily. What is the third option? The third option is that the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, in the person of the director, holds your guardianship in trust until a court of competent jurisdiction determines a placement. That is me, that would be me, I am offering. She held out the parchment and a small black quill, which she had also withdrawn from the cloak, in a motion so practiced it was to Harry almost a sleight of hand. You do not have to sign, she said. You can wait, you can ask me questions first, you can ask for an advocate. There is in fact a Wizarding Legal Society for Orphan Minors of Magical Descent, and they have an on-call advocate at all times, and I can have her here within 7 minutes. I want you to know this. Do you want me to call her? Harry looked at the parchment, he looked at the quill, he looked at Madame Bones. He looked last at the cloak around his shoulders, at the inside lining, which was a dark slate blue and which was warm. No, he said, I do not want you to call her. I would like to ask you 3 questions and then I would like to sign. Ask them. First, if I sign this, who in this house do I have to see again ever against my will? No one. Second, if I sign this, can my cousin be told eventually that I do not hate him? Madame Bones, for the second time in the conversation, allowed her face to break for a fraction of a second. The break was very small. It was, in the way that small breaks in trained faces are, more eloquent than a sob would have been from anyone else. Yes, she said, I will tell him myself. Third, if I sign this, can the man you mentioned, the godfather, can his case be looked at? Yes. By you? By me personally. I will not delegate it. I will not allow it to be delegated. I will hold the file in my own hands until it closes. Harry nodded once. He took the quill. He looked at the parchment for a moment, at the blank where his name was to go, at the small printed line below it for date and place of signature. He thought briefly about his mother, and about the basket on the doorstep, and about the cupboard under the stairs, and about Wednesday the spider egg sack, and about the small pile of broken plastic soldiers' tonks was even now somewhere down the hall, gently lifting one by one into a labeled box. He thought about his own name, which had been his for 9 years and had been used by the inhabitants of this house an average of fewer than 4 times a week. He signed his name. He signed it in the careful round print of a child who had not yet been taught to do cursive. The H came out a little big. The Y at the end of Harry curled the wrong way. He gave the quill back. Madame Bones took the parchment, folded it, and placed it back inside the pocket of the cloak which was around his shoulders and which she did not, in the moment, ask him to give back. Mr. Potter, she said. Yes, ma'am. As of this signature, you are a ward of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Your placement between now and the determination of your godfather's case will be at the discretion of a trusted wizarding foster placement to be arranged by my office no later than this evening. Your medical care, your education, and your legal representation are now my office's responsibility. No one in this house can compel you to do anything ever again. Do you understand? Yes, do you have any questions? 1. Ask. Will the trial be public? Madame Bones considered this. She had not until this question fully realized how much this 9-year-old had thought about. She thought about the answer. The thought took 2 seconds. She decided in the 2 seconds that her answer to a 9-year-old was going to be the same answer she would have given to a 35-year-old. She had not lied to her witnesses in 22 years. She did not intend to begin. Parts of it, she said. The Muggle parts will be handled by the Muggle police in such a way that the magical details are obscured. The magical parts will be handled by the Wizengamot in closed session, not because we are hiding anything, Mr. Potter, but because we are required by statute to. The Wizengamot can be petitioned by you or by your guardian to release a redacted public account of its findings. I will tell you now, if you petition for that release, I will support the petition. I will petition, said Harry. Then we will release. He nodded. He looked briefly at the front door, which was still half open behind Madame Bones, and at the day outside, which was a flat municipal blue, and at the milk on the doorstep, which was now beginning to be slightly warm to the touch but had not yet gone off. The world, he noted, was continuing to occur. He had not been certain it would. He had half imagined that the events of the morning had broken something in the architecture of the world and that the world would, in some unspecified way, have to be rebuilt before he could go on living in it. He saw now that the world had simply continued. The milk had not noticed. The hedges had not noticed. Only the people in the hallway had noticed, and they had all, in their separate ways, accepted the noticing and gone on with the next thing. He found this enormously reassuring. He filed it. Madame Bones rose. She did not, however, withdraw the cloak. She placed her hand for the first time on Harry's shoulder very lightly through the cloak and held it there for the length of one breath, and then she said, "I will be back in 50 seconds with the healer. Do not stand up. Do not move the rib. If you need anything, my Auror Williamson will be in the doorway and you may speak to him and he will not lie to you. Is that all right?" "Yes, Mr. Potter. Yes. For what it is worth, Mr. Potter, which I think is not nothing, I am sorry." "For what?" "For having signed off in 1987 on the report that said this house was adequate. I was wrong. The wrongness was mine. I am personally accountable for it. I will in the next several months be personally accountable for it in detail in the relevant inquiry. I am not telling you this so that you will forgive me. I am telling you this so that you will know that I know. Do you understand?" Harry looked at her. "Yes, thank you." She turned. She walked briskly but not fast down the hall and out the front door. The door closed quietly behind her. 3 seconds later there was a pop on the front step and a second pop and then nothing. Auror Williamson in the kitchen doorway glanced once toward Harry and held up 2 fingers in the small private universal Auror to witness signal that meant, "I am 2 steps from you, you are safe, I am watching, you do not have to be." Harry returned the signal, also 2 fingers, with the small mirror precision of a child who had been given his first piece of Auror tradecraft and had silently sworn to honor it, and then he closed his eyes and let his head rest finally against the wallpaper of the hall. In a stone office in London, the silver instrument had stopped ringing. It had somewhere in the middle of Madame Bones's conversation with Harry settled with a small, soft tone into a steady, deep humming note. The note would last in the office for the next 6 months. After that, it would gradually become inaudible, although it would not, in fact, stop. The instrument had been built 800 years before to sing for the duration of a Sheringan awakening in the British Isles. It had sung 4 times before today, each time briefly. It had not, in any previous instance, settled into a steady hum. The instrument was, in the only way that an 800-year-old enchanted object can be, surprised. It was processing. In the hallway of number 4, the 9-year-old boy with the cloak around his shoulders breathed slowly and shallowly around 3 broken ribs, and waited for the healer and watched behind his closed eyes the small careful folding back of the country he had built. Until the country was in his mind only a folded paper crane on a shelf he could not see, and he understood without language, without metaphor, without anyone's needing to tell him that the crane would always be where he needed it to be. Outside, on the doorstep, the milk, still in its bottles, did not move. A magpie crossed the back garden once more, low, and this time it landed. Chapter 4. The Trial and Institutionalization. The Wisengamot, on the morning of August the 14th, 1989, convened in closed session in courtroom 3 of the Ministry of Magic at 10 o'clock. It convened, more precisely, 14 minutes late, because Augusta Longbottom had insisted on inspecting the lobby clock and adjusting it by 2 minutes, and Tiberius Ogden had insisted on inspecting Augusta Longbottom's adjustment, and there had been briefly a small dignified procedural argument in front of the courtroom doors about whether the clock should reflect Greenwich Mean Time, Solar Standard Time, or the older and theoretically deprecated Magical Mean Time, which used Stonehenge as its baseline reference and had not been formally retired since 1402, although it had been formally non-recognized since 1798. The clock was in the end set to Greenwich Mean Time on the casting vote of the senior chief warlock present, who was on this morning in the absence of Albus Dumbledore, who had not been informed of the session by the express written instruction of the Director of Magical Law Enforcement, a tall, thin woman named Griselda Marchbanks, who was sufficiently elderly to be unimpressed by all of them, and who chaired the bench with the slow precision of someone who had been doing exactly this for 67 years. The case before the Wisengamot was, in the official scroll text, Crown v. Dursley and persons heretofore unidentified, with the parenthetical subhead, concerning the welfare and bloodline magic awakening of one Harry James Potter, minor. The case before the Wisengamot was, in unofficial reality, the largest legal earthquake the magical British state had experienced since the formal dissolution of the Death Eater proceedings in 1982, and everyone present knew it. Madame Bones, in the witness box, did not look like a person experiencing a legal earthquake. She looked like a person reading a grocery list to a cousin she had not seen for a fortnight. This was, by long professional practice, the voice she always used in front of the Wisengamot, because in 22 years of testimony she had observed that the senior bench responded approximately 3% more favorably to monotone delivery than to dramatic delivery, and 3% over a career mattered. The relevant facts, members of the bench, are as follows. On the morning of the 31st of July, at approximately 12:14 post-meridim, the bloodline tracking instrument designated DMLE reference 713, known colloquially as the Akimi bell, after the witch in whose estate the instrument was last verified to have rung, sounded for the first time in 43 years. Reference 713 is calibrated to the awakening signature of a class of ocular bloodline magics historically associated with the Uchiha lineage of magical Japan and its scattered diaspora. The instrument rang once at 12:14, a second time at 12:15, a third time at 12:16. I attended the scene with a 4-hour team within 7 minutes of the third ring. I will note that the response time would have been 5 minutes if not for the redirection of 2 of the apparition points in Surrey in the wake of last March's incident, which is a matter the bench may take judicial notice of. Noted, said Griselda Marchbanks mildly. On arrival, I observed the following. The minor in question, Harry James Potter, was conscious, lucid, calm, and seated in the central hall of the residence. He was wearing clothing that did not fit him and had not been clean for at least 9 days. His face showed a split lip. His left side, as later documented by healer Madison, showed 3 broken ribs in the 7th, 9th, and 4th. That is, 2 ribs broken cleanly, 1 cracked, all on dates earlier than today, and 1 fresh, together with bruising to the cervical region consistent with manual constriction, contusions across the back consistent with repeated kicking from the rear and below, and a contusion at the base of the skull approximately the diameter of an adult fist, also from the morning of the 31st. The minor reported when asked that the assault that morning had been administered by his maternal uncle Vernon Dursley, who was at that moment incapacitated on the floor of the same hallway alongside Petunia Dursley, the minor's maternal aunt, in a state I will describe in a moment. Marchbanks raised one finger. Madame Bones paused. Director? Yes, Chief Warlock. Before you continue, for the record, was the minor at the moment of your arrival capable of self-defense? Chief Warlock, in the strictest sense, the minor had, by the time I arrived, already defended himself. The capacity question is therefore retroactive. I will say this. He was 9, he weighed approximately 4 stone 6, he was injured in 3 rib bones and a skull, and he had 3 minutes before neutralized 2 adult attackers without a wand. Without a wand, Marchbanks repeated slowly. Without a wand, Chief Warlock. Continue. On observation of the 2 adults, I noted the following. Vernon Dursley, age 41, ambulatory adult male approximately 16 stone, was supine on the parquet of the hall, breathing in a non-responsive state with tracking eye movement and active mouth tremor. That is, he was not catatonic, not in a coma, and not dead, but he was not in any conventional sense conscious. He was, in healer's parlance, internally elsewhere. Petunia Dursley, age 40, seated against the wall, also breathing, also non-responsive, also internally elsewhere, but exhibiting a different presentation, quieter, with visible weeping but no tremor. The third occupant of the residence, the minor Dudley Dursley, age 9, was in the kitchen, ambulatory but distressed, whispering the word sorry on a sub-vocal repeating cycle. He was not in danger. He was simply, in healer's parlance, internally elsewhere as well, but in a different country. In a different country, Marchbanks repeated. Chief Warlock, and this is the central operative fact of the case, the minor Mr. Potter informed me at 12:24 post-meridim that he had administered, using the ocular technique he named Tsukuyomi, 3 discrete subjective time imprints to the 3 other occupants of the residence. Mr. Vernon Dursley received 72 subjective hours of relived cruelty inflicted upon Mr. Potter, viewed from Mr. Potter's perspective. Mrs. Petunia Dursley received the same, with a different content set. Mr. Dudley Dursley, a child, received 12 subjective hours of a calibrated subset, focused on age-appropriate schoolyard cruelties he had inflicted on Mr. Potter. The Wisengamot did not gasp. The Wisengamot, when in closed session, did not gasp. Gasping was, in the formal procedural manual, a Class 2 disruptive reaction and had been since 1772. The Wisengamot did instead the particular thing it did when shocked: it adjusted its sleeves. 47 members on the bench, in unison, with no apparent consciousness of doing so, very slightly readjusted the cuffs of their robes. There was a small ambient sound, like the rustling of dry paper, then it stopped. Marchbanks said, Director, I have a procedural question. Yes, Chief Warlock. Are you confident, on the basis of the minor's own report and the corroborating evidence of the 3 subjects' present mental state, that what the minor administered was an act of self-defense? Madame Bones did not answer for a beat. The beat was, by her practice, intentional. She had learned in 22 years that the senior bench preferred answers that arrived after a visible second of thought to answers that arrived instantaneously, because the visible second of thought reassured them that the witness was, in fact, thinking. Chief Warlock, with respect. The doctrine of self-defense, as currently codified in the British wizarding statutes, contemplates physical defense against active assault, and it has historically been read narrowly. The minor was, at the time of his application of the technique, being actively assaulted in the physical sense. The technique was applied, and I have spoken with him at length and reviewed pensive evidence which is available to the bench in camera, directly in response to the active blow that broke his seventh rib. There is, however, a complicating factor, which is the technique he applied was disproportionate to the immediate physical threat in scope, but it was, I would argue, proportionate to the cumulative pattern. The minor was acting not against the single blow that had broken his rib, but against the 9 years of which that blow was the most recent instance. The question, members of the bench, is whether the doctrine of self-defense in our jurisdiction permits a defendant to act not against an episode but against a pattern. It is my position that it does in cases of bloodline magic by long precedent, see Anwin v. Cadwallader 893 and the Blackletter Standard in Diggory v. Mortlake 1641, although I will concede that those precedents are old and that the bench may wish to set fresh doctrine here. Director, Chief Warlock, I have a second procedural question. Yes, at the moment of the minor's awakening, did the boy have access to instruction in the technique? Did he know what he was doing? He did not, Chief Warlock. He did not, at the moment of awakening, have access to any instruction whatsoever, magical or muggle, in the use of the Sharingan or any related ocular technique. The relevant fact for the bench's consideration is that the awakening of certain bloodline magics is accompanied by what the historical literature calls inherited reflex. That is, the bloodline carrier intuits in the moment of awakening the use of the first technique most natural to the lineage. Tsukuyomi appears in the Akimi corpus as the first inherited reflex in approximately 63% of recorded awakenings. The minor, therefore, did exactly what a 900-year tradition of his bloodline would have predicted him to do by reflex, without instruction, under conditions of active mortal threat. He cannot be held to a standard of trained caster intent. Director. Chief Warlock, a third procedural question, and it will be the last, I expect, before we proceed to disposition. Yes, what is your recommendation? Madame Bones drew breath. The drawing of the breath was the only thing she allowed herself in 52 minutes of testimony that was even remotely theatrical. She held the breath for half a second, she let it out. Chief Warlock, members of the bench, my recommendation in the matter of Vernon Dursley is the following. The man is, at this moment, not catatonic in the medical sense. He is in a sustained state of what Healer Madison has in the medical literature designated imprinted cruelty reorientation syndrome. The condition is not life-threatening in the body but is incompatible with continued residence in the world he previously inhabited. He cannot, by mental fitness, hold employment. He cannot, by mental fitness, parent. He cannot, by mental fitness, be returned to a household with his nephew or with any child. He cannot, however, be incarcerated under the criminal statute, because the operative offense, child maltreatment in the Muggle world, is in our jurisdiction a Muggle matter. And the secondary offense, provocation of bloodline awakening, is not a statutory offense and cannot, by my legal advice, be retroactively constructed into one. I recommend, therefore, indefinite institutionalization in the secure long-term wing of St. Mungo's, the Janus Thickey ward, 4th floor, under the care of Healer Strout and her team, with semi-annual review. The recommendation in the matter of Petunia Dursley is, with reservations, the same. What reservations? Chief Warlock. Petunia Dursley is, in the medical opinion of Healer Madison, recoverable, not immediately, not in 5 years, but recoverable. The presentation of her syndrome is different from her husband's in a single critical respect. Her syndrome is built around a reawakened capacity for love, specifically love for her late sister. The capacity, having been 47 years damned, is at present too large for her body to operate, and she is non-functional. The capacity, however, may be slowly metabolized. In 20 years, perhaps less, Petunia Dursley may be capable of holding a conversation again. She will not be the Petunia Dursley she was before the 31st of July. She will be a different person. I recommend that she be institutionalized as Vernon is at the Janus Thickey ward, with the proviso that she be reviewed not semi-annually but quarterly, and that in the event of a competent assessment of fitness, she be permitted at that time to write, under Healer's supervision and in her own hand, a single letter to her nephew which may, at the discretion of the nephew's guardian and the nephew himself, be received. A small murmur went up from the bench. Marchbanks raised her finger again, the murmur died, and the boy, Dudley Dursley, age 9, is a child. He received 12 subjective hours of inherited material from a calibrated subset of schoolyard cruelties. He has, in the 72 hours since, made approximately 740 separate apologies in a subvocal cycle. He is not catatonic. He is not in any way incompetent. He is, however, fragile, and he is in mourning for his parents, for himself, and for his cousin, and he is in the early stages of what his treating healer is calling arrested cruelty. That is, the spontaneous internal cessation of the bullying current that had constituted, by the family's own description, the central organizing fact of his 9 years of life. The minor Mr. Dursley is recovering. The minor Mr. Dursley is also, in the assessment of his treating mind healer, in danger of internalizing the experience as guilt rather than learning, which would be a poor outcome. I recommend that he be placed on a probationary basis with his paternal aunt Marjorie Dursley, with monthly visits from a magical-trained social worker, and that he be enrolled at magical government expense in a Muggle counseling program of which the Department of Magical Law Enforcement holds satisfactory records, namely the Drabwell Children's Therapeutic Service in Slough, with which we have a long-standing arrangement and a reliable obliviation protocol. I further recommend that in due course Dudley Dursley be permitted to write, also under supervision, a single letter to his cousin which the cousin may at his discretion accept or decline. And the minor Mr. Potter. The minor Mr. Potter is currently, as a matter of legal record, a ward of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement under temporary guardianship, signed 8 days ago in his own hand. He is presently residing at the home of Andromeda Tonks, formerly Black, who is providing emergency foster care under a long-standing arrangement with this department. He is medically stable. The broken ribs have been mended. He has been examined by 3 separate ocular specialists, including by my request Master Healer Mei Hu of the Imperial Magical College in Beijing, who was, with the bench's permission, brought to London on a 36-hour visiting status to confirm the diagnosis. The diagnosis is confirmed. Mr. Potter has, in the medical and bloodline magical sense, undergone a Sharingan awakening of the second rank kind with Mangekyo manifestation. The condition is permanent. It is not, however, in any way pathological. He is, in the assessment of all consulting experts, an unusually well-balanced and well-spoken 9-year-old who has had a remarkably stable 30-day adjustment to a condition that the literature warns may often produce, in adult-onset cases, a range of dissociative complications. He has produced no such complications. He is in many ways the simplest part of this case, and his placement, pending the outcome of a related case which I have separately requested the bench to expedite, namely the file of Sirius Orion Black, Azkaban prisoner. Mr. Potter's permanent placement is recommended to be with his legally named godfather, Sirius Black, in the event that Mr. Black is exonerated by the upcoming review. In the event that Mr. Black is not exonerated, Mr. Potter's placement will be with Andromeda Tonks, who has expressed, in writing, her willingness to assume permanent guardianship at the request of the boy and at the agreement of this department. Director, Chief Warlock. You have, by my count, asked the bench to take judicial notice of 3 previously unscheduled matters in this single hearing: the placement audit, the bloodline magic awakening, and now the case of Sirius Black. Would you care to add any others, or shall we attempt to conclude? There was on the bench a small ripple of dry amusement. Madame Bones inclined her head a quarter inch. Chief Warlock, with respect, I was going to wait until the disposition, but since you have asked, there is one more matter. The case file of Sirius Black, when last examined by my office, contained a sealed will, the will of one Lily Potter née Evans, dated October the 29th, 1981, witnessed by Albus Dumbledore and Alistair Moody. The will was sealed by direction of the Chief Warlock's office on November the 3rd, 1981, 26 hours after the deaths of James and Lily Potter at Godric's Hollow. The will names Sirius Black, in plain language, as the sole legal guardian of Harry James Potter in the event of the testator's deaths. The will explicitly excludes the Dursleys. The will was suppressed, and the suppression was carried out in the formal record on the signature of the then Chief Warlock. The then Chief Warlock was Albus Dumbledore. I would like the bench to take judicial notice of this fact. I would like the bench to do so today. The Wizengamot did not adjust its sleeves this time. The Wizengamot did the second thing it did when shocked. It sat very still and did not breathe for nearly 5 seconds. The 5 seconds were the longest silence Madame Bones had elicited from the bench in 11 years of testimony. Marchbanks did not break her composure. Marchbanks was 67 years into a career in this room, and Marchbanks had, by elderly indifference, become precisely the woman to chair this hearing today. She inclined her head slightly and said in the same dry tone she had used for the clock argument, "So noted." The senior court scribe scratched the relevant note onto the relevant scroll. Director, Chief Warlock. The bench will now move to disposition. You will, in the next 40 minutes, watch the bench discharge the recommendations you have made, with such modifications as we consider appropriate. You will then be required to attend a closed session in chambers where we will discuss in considerably more detail the matter of the suppressed will. You will, I think, want to bring counsel. I have counsel on standby, Chief Warlock. Of course you do. Marchbanks's mouth very slightly did not smile. The not smile was the warmest thing the bench would do all day. Disposition will commence in 10 minutes. Director, you may sit down. Madame Bones sat down. She did not even now allow herself to look at the man at the back of the courtroom, a tall, thin healer in lime green robes who had been silently observing for the full 52 minutes, and who, on the relevant signature, was about to escort two newly confined patients from the holding wing to the Janus Thicky ward. The healer was Augustus Pye. The healer was, as it happened, an old friend. In the holding wing, behind the courtroom, in a small white room with a single window and 3 chairs and a low cot, Vernon Dursley sat on the cot, staring at a wicker basket that was not in the room. He had been staring at it for 8 days. He would stare at it by the long internal clock of the 72 hours that had been deposited inside him on the 31st of July, for the rest of his life. The staring would, in time, modulate into a kind of work, a kind of small, patient, infinitely repeated rearrangement of the imaginary basket into shapes that were not, on review, mistakes. By 2007, he would be capable, in the assessment of his treating healer, of pronouncing, in a low, quiet voice, the 17-word formal apology that the Department of Magical Law Enforcement had drafted, with the consent of his nephew in his name. He would not, however, be capable of more. The drafted apology would be read out to his nephew in a closed room at St. Mungo's by Vernon Dursley himself, with 3 healers and 1 orer present on the 7th of December 2007. His nephew, who would by then be 27, would listen. His nephew would not in any visible way react. His nephew would, 3 weeks later, send a single sentence in his own hand to the senior healer of the ward, instructing that Mr. Dursley be told, when the time was right, that his apology had been received and acknowledged. There would be no further correspondence. In the holding wing in another small white room, Petunia Dursley sat in a chair by a window and looked out at a small interior courtyard in which somehow a magnolia tree was always in bloom. She did not know how the tree was always in bloom. She did not ask. She was the simpler patient, simpler in the medical sense, although not by any measure the smaller one. She wept for the first 3 years. She wept softly and without theater. She wept while she was eating, and while she was being washed, and while she was being read to. She did not weep at night, because at night, by some mechanism the healers could not fully explain, her dreams were of her sister and her grandmother, and in the dreams there was no need for weeping. By the 5th year she had stopped weeping in the day as well. By the 7th year she was reading novels. By the 8th year she was, with the supervision of the senior healer, beginning to write small, slow private compositions she did not show to anyone. She did, in the 22nd year of her stay, ask permission to write a letter. The permission was granted. The letter, when it was finished, was 6 paragraphs long. It would not here be quoted. It will be quoted in a moment in 2011 in a different chapter when its addressee, by then a grown man, by then a husband, by then a father of a child who had inherited his eyes, would receive it. In another room of the wing, slightly off the main corridor, Dudley Dursley was sitting in a low chair with his Aunt Marjorie beside him. Aunt Marjorie was, against the predictions of essentially everyone who had ever known her, behaving with restraint. The restraint was not the result of moral growth. The restraint was the result of the small, short conversation Madame Bones had had with her 3 days before in a magistrate's chambers in Reading, in which Madame Bones had said, in the same flat grocery list voice she used for the Wisengamot, "Miss Dursley, you have one chance at this. You have one chance at being the aunt who took care of the boy properly. I will check monthly. If I find that you have not, I will personally remove the boy and place him in our custody, and you will not see him again. And I will, in addition, ensure that the existence of the magical world is held in front of you for 30 seconds, in the form of one of my aurors transfiguring your front door into a goat, after which you will be obliviated and the goat will be returned to the form of a door. And you will spend the rest of your life with a vague, unshakable conviction that you failed at something extremely important and cannot remember what it was. Do we understand each other?" Aunt Marjorie, who had not been spoken to in that voice since the death of her father, had said yes. She was on the morning of the 14th of August in the chair beside her nephew, observing her own restraint with a kind of mild private wonder. She was in the months that followed going to discover that the restraint once practiced was the basis of a quality of life she had not previously been aware of being capable of. The bulldogs would in time be rehomed. The fortnightly bottle of port would in time be reduced. The nephew would in time sleep through the night. None of this was magical. All of this was the consequence of one short conversation, conducted by one tired director of magical law enforcement in a magistrate's chambers in Reading 3 days before. In the courtroom on Marchbanks's signal, the disposition was read. Vernon Dursley, Indefinite Institutionalization, Janus Thicky Ward, Semi-Annual Review. Petunia Dursley, Indefinite Institutionalization, Janus Thicky Ward, Quarterly Review, Supervised Letter Privilege in 20 years. Dudley Dursley, supervised placement with Marjorie Dursley, monthly check-in, mandatory therapeutic enrollment. Harry James Potter, ward of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, foster placement with Andromeda Tonks pending the outcome of the related case of Sirius Orion Black. Number 4, Privet Drive, sealed pending the outcome of the audit of the Muggle Placement Subcommittee. The audit itself, set into motion by Marchbanks's gavel, would consume in the months to come 18 department staff weeks of investigative time and produce an internal report 247 pages long, of which 48 pages would in 1990 be released to the general wizarding press, and would cause in the same year 3 resignations from the Department of Education and 1 from the office of the minister himself. The gavel fell. In the holding wing, the healers came for Vernon and Petunia. Vernon, who had not spoken in 8 days except to ask, twice, where the basket was placed gently in a chair, and the chair was lifted by 2 healers, and Vernon and the chair were apparated by sight-along to the Janus Thicky ward. Petunia, who had not asked for anything in 8 days, was helped to her feet and walked with the small, careful step of a person learning to walk again to the courtyard, where she paused for a moment to look at the magnolia and to put out her hand and touch one of its petals very lightly. She did not pick it. She turned and walked, with the healer at her elbow, the rest of the way to the apparition point. In the courtroom, Marchbanks dismissed the bench, dismissed the gallery, and inclined her head very slightly at Madame Bones, who returned the inclination with the smallest possible nod. The 2 women left through different doors. They did not speak to each other again that day. They would speak to each other in chambers 3 days later for 2 hours with no scribe and no other witnesses present. Of that conversation, no record exists. What can be said about it is that, at the end of it, Madame Bones returned to her office with the file of Sirius Orion Black tucked under her arm, and she sent for Auror Robards, and she said 2 words to him. The 2 words were, "Begin retrieval." Robards left the office at a brisk walk. Within 90 seconds, he was in the secure apparition chamber. Within 12 minutes, he had assembled a 4-person team. Within 4 hours, he and his team were on a ministry boat off the coast of the North Sea in a heavy rain, approaching the dark and unfortunately familiar silhouette of Azkaban prison. The Dementors saw them coming. The Dementors did not approach the boat. The Dementors had, in the last 3 days, received a formal letter from the Director of Magical Law Enforcement, on parchment with a small silver griffin holding a balance, instructing them in extremely careful language to permit the retrieval team to extract 1 prisoner without obstruction, and informing them that any obstruction whatever would be construed as an act of provocation and would be answered in the long term. With a complete and formal reconsideration of the contract, under which Dementors were permitted to operate as auxiliaries of the British wizarding state, the Dementors did not, in the strict sense, read the letter. The Dementors did, however, in their own way understand it. They withdrew, the boat docked. The team stepped onto the rotting wood of the lowest landing platform of the prison, and Auror Robards, who had been on the boat for 4 hours and had not in that time said anything beyond logistical necessities, looked up at the gray vertical face of the prison and said to no one in particular in a low, quiet voice, "All right, let's get the man out." Outside, the rain continued. The boat's small lantern in the dark was the only point of warm light for 200 miles. In a kitchen in a small house in Tunbridge Wells at the same hour, an Auror named Williamson sat across from a 9-year-old boy with red eyes and 3 tomo in each iris and the careful, small, contained posture of a child who had decided 8 days ago to be calm about everything for the rest of his life. Williamson did not speak. He was on guard. The boy was, in the slow, unembellished way he had been doing for an hour, eating a sandwich. The sandwich was cheese and tomato. The sandwich was the 3rd he had eaten that afternoon. He had not, until the past 8 days, eaten 3 sandwiches in an afternoon in his life. Across the kitchen at the stove, Andromeda Tonks, who had been told the previous evening by Madame Bones that she was about to host the most magically significant minor in Britain for an indefinite period, stirred a pot of soup. She did not turn. She did not in any way look as though she were the kind of woman who had spent the previous evening crying for 1 straight hour at a kitchen table over a cup of tea. She was, however, that kind of woman. She had, at the end of the hour, dried her face and said to her husband Ted in a voice that did not waver, "I will love him as my own, I will love him as my own." Ted, in the next room, was now setting out a chess set. He had read in a brief from the Auror's office that the boy had taught himself chess by watching through a window of a tea shop in Surrey. Ted had not in his life been able to resist a child who wanted to learn chess. He was going to ask this evening whether Harry would like a game. He suspected in his husband's intuition that Harry would say yes. He was correct. Outside the window in the small garden of the small house in Tunbridge Wells, the late summer light was very long. A magpie crossed the garden once low, and this time, as it had now learned to do, it landed. Chapter 5, Sirius Freed in Placement. The retrieval of Sirius Orion Black from Azkaban prison took, in the end, less time than the legal review that preceded it. This was because the legal review consisted of one woman in an office, reading at her usual professional pace, while the retrieval consisted of 4 trained Aurors moving through a structure they had been studying by way of standing order Auror protocol. For a number of years, the proportional outcome was inevitable. Madame Bones in the office took 8 days. She took them deliberately. She did not want, having waited 7.5 years to look at this file properly, to look at it improperly now. She had the file delivered to her office on a Wednesday. She closed her door at 11 in the morning and reopened it 8 days later at 6 in the evening. With the file flagged in 11 separate places by small colored ribbons and a single white silk one, the silk one indicating the relevant page of suppression, the page on which in 1981 the then Chief Warlock had signed off on the sealing of Lily Potter's will. The white silk ribbon was, by the 11 o'clock of the 8th morning, beginning to fray slightly at the edge, because Madame Bones had picked it up and put it down approximately 340 times in those 8 days. She was, by professional disposition, not a woman who picked things up and put them down. She did it now because what was on that page was difficult to look at, and she had decided by the 3rd day that the difficulty was not a sign that she should look at it less but a sign that she should look at it more, until the difficulty was no longer an event in her life but a tool in her hand. By the 8th day, the difficulty was a tool in her hand. By the 8th day, she had begun making notes for a separate and much larger investigation, the file for which she was internally calling the headmaster file, although she was not yet prepared to say so aloud. The headmaster file was, for now, locked in a 3rd drawer of her desk and would, in the months to come, grow. She had not in 22 years been the kind of person who lit a fire she did not intend to control. She was not going to start with this one either. The headmaster file would wait. What would not wait was Sirius Orion Black. The file of Mr. Black, on plain examination by anyone competent who had not been emotionally invested in the outcome, was a structurally embarrassing document. The investigation in October and November of 1981 had been conducted by the office of the then senior Auror, who was the immediate predecessor of Madame Bones in the chain of command. A man named Crouch, who had been, by Madame Bones's private long-standing assessment, more interested in convictions than in justice, and who had in the relevant year been on a personal political vendetta of his own. The file did not contain a trial transcript. The file did not contain a sworn statement by the defendant. The file did not contain, and this was the most clearly embarrassing absence, the standard pre-Azkaban psychiatric attestation of mental fitness to stand trial. The file did contain a brief 1-paragraph signed memorandum from then senior Auror Crouch, which Madame Bones had now read 46 times, dated November 3, 1981, in which Mr. Black was described as having been summarily transferred to long-term custody pending administrative review, in the absence of which administrative review the long-term custody had been in practice a sentence. There had been no administrative review, there had been no trial. There had in 7.5 years been no formal motion to revisit the case, because, as Madame Bones had now confirmed by speaking on the 3rd day of her file week to the senior records clerk of the Magical Court of Petitions, the case had not been a case in the strict procedural sense since 1981. It had been an administrative matter, and the administrative matter had simply, by long bureaucratic inertia, never been concluded. She could conclude it. She had in fact the express authority to conclude it from her own desk, by signature in 5 minutes without referring the matter to any higher body, by way of a particular clause of the Magical Administration Act of 1882 which had been written precisely to allow the head of a department to clean up administrative loose ends without procedural fuss. The clause had not been invoked in 14 years. The clause was, at this moment, going to be invoked in 6. She summoned Robards. He arrived in 90 seconds. She handed him a single sheet of parchment. The parchment had her seal at the top, her signature at the bottom, and 3 short paragraphs in the middle. The paragraphs said, with the kind of administrative bureaucratic blandness that did not, on first read, sound like the legal reversal of a decade of injustice. The long-term custody status of Mr. Sirius Orion Black, Azkaban prisoner reference number 47228, was hereby provisionally lifted by order of the director, effective immediately, pending a formal post-administrative hearing to be scheduled within 72 hours of his removal from the prison facility, said hearing to be convened in chambers in front of Chief Warlock Marchbanks for the purpose of determining the appropriate disposition of the case. Robards read it. He looked at her. The looking was the closest a senior Auror would come to a smile in front of his director in working hours. Director, Auror Robards. Anything else? 2 things. The first, I want you to extract Mr. Black with dignity. I want him given a clean cloak, a hot drink, and a private room for the first 90 minutes after extraction. I do not want him paraded through the atrium. I want him brought up the back stair in sight along by an Auror whose face he will not immediately associate with the events of 1981. I would suggest Auror Williamson, who joined the department in '85. Williamson, however, is currently assigned to protective detail. He can be released for 90 minutes if you ask Andromeda Tonks, who has guardianship of the protective subject this week. Andromeda will say yes. Andromeda will also, I will warn you, expect that you come to her kitchen for a cup of tea afterward, and you will. Director, the second, I want you to bring me back a single object from the cell if it is still there. There was, when Mr. Black was arrested, on his person a Muggle photograph in a small leather frame. The photograph was of his godson, age 4 months, sitting on the lap of his goddaughter, namely Lily Potter, who in life had a great fondness for her own old Polaroid camera, which is a Muggle imaging instrument that was in 1981 regarded by some on her side of the family with mild suspicion. The photograph was confiscated when Mr. Black was placed in his cell by the duty intake officer. It was logged on the day into the prison contraband cabinet. If on a thorough check the photograph is still in that cabinet, and Auror Robards, you and I both know how unlikely it is that any contraband cabinet at Azkaban has been actually rotated since 1981, I want you to bring it. To me personally, today, Director, that is all, Director, he went. 4 hours later, on a North Sea boat in a heavy rain, Auror Robards stepped off onto the lowest landing of the prison, told the Dementors, in a voice that was not loud but was extremely confident, to step back, and watched them step back and turn to his 3 Aurors and said, "All right, let's get the man out." Sirius Orion Black in his cell on the 4th tier did not know the Aurors were coming. Sirius Orion Black did not in any reliable sense know what day it was. Sirius Orion Black on the relevant morning was sitting on the stone floor of his cell with his back to the wall, with his knees drawn up, with his hair down to his shoulders, with his beard down to his collarbone, and with his eyes, and this was the part the Aurors would later, in the brief, describe with care, open. He had been doing the animagus trick for 7.5 years, and the trick had bought him on most days perhaps 3 to 5 hours of subjective remove from the Dementors per 24-hour period. But the trick was increasingly expensive, and he had, by his own private internal accounting, about 3 months of usable life left in him before he could no longer transform back. After which he would slowly become a dog who had once been a man, and would, after that, become only a dog. He had been, for the past 3 days, holding a small object in his left hand. He had taken the object off the wall of his cell, where it had been wedged, almost imperceptibly, into a crack in the masonry behind his cot. He had wedged it there himself in 1981 in his 2nd week of confinement, with the unspoken plan that on some future day he would have the strength to take it back out and look at it, and would, by looking at it, remind himself of why he was holding on. The object, he had assumed, would remain there long enough to be a comfort to him at some unspecified later date. He had not, until 3 days ago, been able to bring himself to take it out and look. It had been the unspecified later date for 7.5 years, and 7.5 years was the duration he had quietly told himself he would last, after which, if no rescue was coming, he would stop and become the dog. The object was a photograph in a small leather frame. The photograph was of his godson at 4 months, sitting on the lap of his goddaughter, who had been laughing at him for some unrecorded reason. Sirius had been the one to take the photograph. Lily had refused to look at the camera at the right moment, which was why the photograph was, in the strictest sense of her, in mid-laugh, with her head turned slightly away from the lens, with the baby on her lap looking up at her with the expression of a small green-eyed alien who had been brought to Earth after some considerable expense and was now, despite all difficulties of translation, very much enjoying his stay. Sirius held the photograph now. He had looked at it since taking it out 3 days ago, every waking hour. He had decided, sometime in the 2nd day, that the photograph had been hidden in the wall in 1981 not for the purpose of bringing him strength exactly, but for the purpose of being something to look at the end. He had decided that he would look at it when the moment came. He had told himself on the 3rd day that the moment was within reach. He had told himself on the 3rd day, with the small, calm, dignified pragmatism of a man who has spent 7.5 years calibrating his own mortality, that there was no shame in having lasted exactly as long as he had lasted, and that the photograph had been a witness, and that the witness deserved to be the last thing he saw. He was, at the moment the door of his cell opened, beginning the small private exercise of memorizing the photograph in greater detail. He had got, by his own scrupulous count, to the 17th small detail, the small bead of light on the rim of his godson's left ear, which Sirius had not previously, in 8 years of intermittent looking, noticed. The door of his cell opened. Sirius did not look up. He had heard the doors open before. He had heard them open many times in 7.5 years for many bad reasons. He had stopped looking up. A voice he did not at first recognize said, "Mr. Black, my name is Robards. I have been instructed by the Director of Magical Law Enforcement to remove you from this prison. The instruction is dated today. Will you come with me?" Sirius did not move. Sirius looked at the small bead of light on the rim of his godson's left ear, and he thought, with the slow internal pragmatism of a man who has been hallucinating intermittently for years and has learned not to give the hallucinations the satisfaction of his attention, that this was a particularly cruel one and that he would, by professional animagus practice, simply not respond. The voice paused. The voice said after a beat, "Mr. Black, I have a letter. I will leave it on the floor. You may read it when you are ready." A piece of folded parchment came into Sirius's field of vision and was laid, very carefully, on the stone of the floor by his left foot. The boot above the parchment was a proper oarer's boot, polished, dry at the toe. It was wet, however, halfway up the calf, in a way that suggested its owner had stepped out of a North Sea boat onto the lowest landing of the prison less than an hour ago. The wetness of the boot, more than the voice or the letter, was what caused Sirius to look up. He looked at the man. The man was tall, sandy-haired, late 30s, with a square jaw and the particular kind of uncruel face that Sirius had not seen on an Auror in 8 years. He did not know the man. He had not been arrested by anyone who looked like this. He had been arrested in October of 1981 by a man named Crouch, who had had a different kind of face entirely. He looked at the letter. The letter was in handwriting he did not initially recognize, but the seal at the top was the silver griffin holding a balance. And the signature at the bottom was, after a moment of careful focus, that of Amelia Bones, whom Sirius had known when they were both at Hogwarts 25 years before, when she had been a fifth-year prefect of Hufflepuff and he had been a first-year Gryffindor who had once, by way of an unimportant prank, set a banister on fire in front of her and had, instead of being punished, been told by a calm 15-year-old in a fading yellow sash that he could either help her put the fire out or write her a one-page essay explaining why he had done it, and that the choice was his. He had at the time chosen the essay. He had not in 25 years forgotten that choice. Sirius read the letter. The letter said, "Sirius, I have read the file. The file was handled badly. I am bringing you home in the only way I can today. The photograph in your hand is yours, so is the baby in the photograph. He is 9 years old now. He is at my colleague Andromeda Tonks's house in Tunbridge Wells. He has been told that I am bringing you out, and he has been told that he may meet you when you are ready and not before. He is calm and well and as safe as a child can be in this world, and he is, in addition, in possession of a magical ability that, if you wish, I will explain to you in detail. He has asked me by name to look at your file. I have done so. I have concluded what you have always known to be true. I am sorry it took 8 years. I am also sorry that the apology you are about to receive is, in the official record, only mine to give. There will in time be others. They will come. They will arrive in their own time. The first apology, Sirius, the apology that matters, is the one from me. I give it to you now." Amelia, Sirius read the letter twice. He did not in the moment weep. He had not wept in years, and he had learned that weeping in this prison took strength he could not afford. He folded the letter slowly. He placed it inside the leather frame behind the photograph where it would not be lost. He looked up at Auror Robards, who was standing with his hand half extended in the very small, careful posture of a man who has been told in advance exactly how slowly to move with the man he is here to retrieve. "Yes," Sirius said. His voice was hoarse from disuse. He cleared his throat. He said again, "Yes, I will come with you." He did not, however, attempt to stand on his own. Robard stepped forward slowly with the small, careful pace of a man approaching a wild dog he is on excellent terms with, and bent at the knee and offered his hand and said, "Mr. Black, take whatever time you need." Sirius took his hand. The hand was warm. Sirius had not held a warm human hand in 7.5 years. He let himself, for the first time, register the warmth. Then he let himself, with Robards' hand under his elbow, stand. The standing was difficult. The standing took, in real-world time, approximately 1 minute. Robards did not in the minute rush him. Robards did not in the minute speak. Robards, when the minute was complete, put a clean cloak which he had brought folded from his own pack around Sirius's shoulders and said only, "There is a boat downstairs. There is a private room at the ministry with hot tea where you can sit for as long as you need. We will apparate by side-along. I will tell you in advance that the side-along will be uncomfortable because you are weak. We will go in 2 short jumps rather than 1 long one. Is this all right?" "Yes, all right, take my arm." Sirius took his arm. He took also in his other hand the photograph in its leather frame. He did not look back at the cell. He did not in the next 43 minutes look back at the prison at all. He looked instead very steadily at the polished toe of Auror Robards' boot. The toe of the boot was a thing he could trust. The toe of the boot did not, in the way many other things might, prove on inspection to be a hallucination. They left. The hearing in chambers 3 days later was the shortest formal proceeding of Marchbanks's career. It lasted, by the scribe's clock, 11 minutes. The bench heard Madame Bones present, in the same flat grocery list voice she always used, the 4 core facts of the case: the absence of trial transcript, the absence of sworn statement, the absence of psychiatric attestation, and the existence of the suppressed will. Marchbanks took notes for approximately 6 of the 11 minutes. At the end, she set down her pen, looked over her half-moon glasses at Sirius, who was sitting in the witness chair in clean robes with his hair cut and his beard trimmed and his weight visibly returning by the day, although the eyes were still the eyes of a man who had been spoken to for 7.5 years by no human voice, and said, "Mr. Black, Chief Warlock, on the basis of the materials presented and the testimony of the director, the bench finds that you were never lawfully convicted. You were, in the formal sense, never lawfully tried. Your custody for the last 7.5 years has been administrative only, and the administrative ground has been today finally found insufficient. The bench is therefore, in the only language available to it, dismissing the matter. You are free to go. The bench owes you, in addition, an apology, not in fairness from this particular bench, which was not the bench responsible, but on behalf of the institution. I tender the apology. I tender it without reservation. I tender it knowing that the apology is not, on its own, sufficient, and the bench has in the past week set in motion a series of supplementary measures of which you will be informed by the director in due course. Do you have anything you wish to say?" Sirius cleared his throat. He had been preparing over the past 3 days what he would say. He had prepared, by his count, 4 different versions, and had decided on the morning of the hearing that none of them were any good and that he would simply, when the moment came, say what was true. He said in a voice that was hoarse but was steady the following: "Chief Warlock, thank you. I do not today have anything else to say. I would, however, like to add for the record that I do not blame this bench. I blame the people who did the thing. I will, in time, take the matter up with those people in the appropriate forum. I will not, in the meantime, allow the matter to take up the kind of room in my life that would prevent me from being today what I have always wanted to be, which is Harry's godfather." The bench, on the morning of the 17th of August, 1989, did the third thing it did when shocked, which was the thing it did most rarely. The bench rose, all 47 members in unison with no formal call to do so. They rose, they stood, they did not speak. They simply stood in their black robes and their silver collars for the length of 3 slow breaths, in the kind of silence the courtroom had not produced in the memory of anyone present. Marchbanks in the center did not look at her colleagues, she looked at Sirius. Then very slightly she inclined her head, and the bench in the same unison inclined theirs. The bench had not, since 1932, performed the silent inclination ceremony for a non-member. They performed it now. Sirius did not understand what he was looking at. He had not, in his Hogwarts days, paid close attention to courtroom procedural lore, and the silent inclination was an obscure point. He understood, however, that it was important, and he stood, and he returned the inclination, and he did so with the small, grave courtesy of a man who would, in the next several years, learn what he had been given by it. The bench sat. The gavel fell. Sirius Orion Black, in clean robes with his hair cut, walked out of courtroom 3 on the 17th of August, 1989. A free man with the photograph of his godson and his goddaughter in the inside pocket of his cloak, and with a single folded piece of parchment in the other inside pocket, the parchment being the letter Madame Bones had sent him in his cell at Azkaban, which he had decided 3 days ago in the private room at the ministry was the only document he was going to carry on his person for the rest of his life. Andromeda Tonks met him in the lobby. She did not say anything. She did not, in fact, hug him, although she had spent the previous evening rehearsing several possible greetings with her husband, who had told her she was over-preparing. She walked up to him in the lobby and looked at his face for about 3 seconds, and then she said in the small, dry voice she had inherited from her grandmother, "Sirius. Andromeda, are you ready for the boy?" Sirius drew a breath. He let it out. He nodded once with a precision that surprised even him. "Yes." She held out her hand. He took it. She apparated them in sight along to the small front garden of the small house in Tunbridge Wells. The garden had, by virtue of the August weather, a small late-summer bush of lavender in bloom. The bush was directly to the left of the front step. Sirius did not, until later, register the bush. It would, in fact, be a memory he returned to in years to come, as the thing he had been looking at when he became, in the actual irreversible sense, the godfather he had always intended to be. The front door opened. A man in his early 40s in a cardigan with a kind round face stepped out, looked at Sirius, looked at Andromeda, said only, "He's in the kitchen, he's been calm. He has had 3 sandwiches today," and stepped, with the small particular generosity of a man who had been at the periphery of a family scene for 2 weeks and knew when to step back out of it again, out of the way. Sirius walked across the garden and up the step and into the small front hall of the small house in Tunbridge Wells, where on the parquet of the floor, and there was, he noted in the very small back of his mind, a piece of parquet here, just like at the place his godson had not today woken up in, sat a small, narrow 9-year-old boy in a clean jumper that fit him properly, with hair that had been cut, with a face that had been recently washed, and with red eyes in which 3 tomos sat motionless. Watching him, Sirius stopped on the threshold. He did not in the moment weep. He had practiced not weeping in case he wept. He had practiced calmly being a person in case he was overwhelmed. He had practiced in the boat cabin at Azkaban 2 weeks ago and at the kitchen of Andromeda's house every morning since the small, simple sentence he had decided on for the moment of meeting. He had decided that he would say to the boy, "Hello, pup, I'm serious, I'm your godfather, I've been waiting for you a long time." He did not in the event say that. What he said instead was a sentence he had not prepared, that came out of his mouth in a voice he did not recognize as his own, that he understood only after he had said it, and that surprised him by being, on consideration, exactly the right thing. He said, "I am sorry I was not there." The boy on the parquet looked at him. The boy on the parquet did not, in the way most 9-year-olds in this circumstance might have, run forward or speak or weep. The boy looked at him. He looked at him for the length of one full slow breath, then he stood. He stood with the small, careful balance of a child whose ribs had been recently mended and were still tender. He crossed the hall slowly in 3 small steps until he was standing directly in front of Sirius, and he looked up into Sirius's face, the new red eyes searching the unfamiliar, gaunt, recently shaved face of his godfather with the small private precision of a child who was by now accustomed to seeing more in a single look than other people saw in 20. "You are sorry," the boy said. "I know." He put his small hand on Sirius's wrist. The hand was warm. It was warmer than Sirius had expected. It was also smaller than Sirius had remembered. He looked down at the hand. The hand stayed where it was. "I have seen the photograph," the boy said. "Madame Bones sent it to me." "You took it?" "Yes, my mother is laughing in it." "Yes, you made her laugh. Sometimes I could, yes." The boy's hand tightened very slightly on Sirius's wrist. "I would like you to make me laugh sometimes," the boy said. "If you can, I do not need you to make me laugh today. I would just like you to know that I would like that eventually." Sirius nodded. He could not in the moment trust his voice. He nodded twice, very slowly. He put his own hand very carefully over the small hand on his wrist. He did not even now weep. He held the hand. He held it for the length of one long, slow breath. "All right, pup," he said. "All right." The boy did not in the next several minutes ask any other questions. He led Sirius by the wrist as if Sirius were the one who needed leading, which on consideration was probably the case, into the kitchen where Ted Tonks had, by some perfect alchemy of small house hospitality, just laid out a chess set on the kitchen table. The boy said, "Do you play Sirius?" Sirius cleared his throat. "I do." "White or black? You choose, pup." The boy considered for a moment. "Black," he said. He sat down at the table. Sirius sat down opposite him. Andromeda put a kettle on. Ted very quietly opened a window so the late summer air could come in. Outside the window, in the small garden, a magpie crossed the lavender once low, and this time it landed on the gatepost and stayed there for a long time with its head tilted to one side, watching. The first game took 47 minutes. Sirius lost. He had not in 8 years played chess against a person who was reading him at this depth. He had also in 8 years not eaten regularly, slept regularly, or thought clearly, but the boy across the table was, in the very polite way of a child who had decided to be courteous about the asymmetry, taking it easy on him. By move 20, Sirius understood this. By move 30, he was glad of it. By move 40, he had begun in the very small back of his own mind to laugh. The boy who was watching with the new red eyes noticed the laugh. He paused mid-move. He looked across the table at his godfather. He smiled very faintly with the small, careful smile of a child who had not in many years had the opportunity to make someone laugh and who was beginning, with a very small private pleasure, to suspect that he might be capable of it after all. Sirius caught his eye, and the laugh came up properly and broke and went all the way to the surface, and Sirius Orion Black laughed for the first time in 7.5 years in a small kitchen in Tunbridge Wells across a chessboard opposite a small, narrow boy with red eyes who was, by this single laugh, becoming the gravitational center of the rest of his life. Outside the window, the magpie on the gatepost did not move. It watched them. It watched them for a long time. When it finally left, it left very quietly, and it went, with the small purposeful flight of a creature that had completed an errand, north, toward London, toward a stone office, toward an old woman with a monocle who was, at the moment, signing a series of further documents on a desk with the kind of steady, patient anger she had been carrying for 8 days and was, finally, beginning to put down. The kettle began to whistle in the kitchen of the small house in Tunbridge Wells. The boy took the white queen on Sirius's 28th move. The game ended on the 34th. Sirius reset the board. "Again? Yes, please. Black again?" the boy considered. "White this time." He had, on the new red eyes' first proper smile of the afternoon, become incrementally in the small particular way of a child who had been alone for a long time and was just beginning to learn that he was no longer the boy he was going to be. Outside, the late summer light went long across the garden, and the lavender in the small breeze moved very slightly, and the magpie flew away. Chapter 6. 3 years at Sirius's, the house in which Sirius Orion Black and his godson lived for the 3 years between Harry's 9th birthday and his 11th was not, by any measure, a typical wizarding household. It was, for one thing, jointly held. Sirius, on the advice of Madame Bones and the practical insistence of Andromeda Tonks, had agreed in the first month of his guardianship that he was not, by any reasonable estimate, in a fit state to raise a child entirely on his own. He could play chess, he could cook 3 things, he could do with reasonable accuracy a number of small household charms, he could in particular transform into a large black dog, which was useful to Harry in a way that surprised Sirius and would, in years to come, surprise Sirius further. He could not, however, manage on his own the slow, steady, patient work of being the only adult in a house with a magically traumatized 9-year-old. He had been 7.5 years in Azkaban. He had in himself a number of small holes that needed time to close. Andromeda, who was at 38 an experienced mother of a 17-year-old daughter and a healer's assistant by trade at St. Mungo's, had moved with her husband Ted and the small accumulated household of 3 of them into the cottage in Wales that Alfred Black had left to Sirius in 1979 and had then never sold, and was therefore the cleanest possible place to start over. The cottage was south of the village of Traer-Didal, off a back road, on a hillside with a wood behind it and a small stream below. This was the second unusual thing. The household was, by the end of the first month, 6 people: Sirius, Harry, Andromeda, Ted, their daughter Nymphadora, who was in the first weeks on her summer holiday between the 7th and 8th years of her own delayed aura training and who was therefore present and who declared on day 3 that she could not in good conscience leave the small boy with the lot of you're all going to be useless, I'll be quiet about it but I'm staying. She did stay. She did not, in the strict sense, manage to be quiet about it, because Nymphadora Tonks had never in 20 years on Earth been quiet about anything, but she was, in the small particular way that mattered, present. She was 20. She did in the first week what she had done at the Aura Academy on her first day of unsupervised junior's protective practice. She walked into the kitchen, looked at Harry and said, "Hello, cousin, you can call me anything you like except Nymphadora, I am Tonks. We are family. I do not on principle kiss family on the cheek because we are not French. I will, however, shake your hand. Are you all right?" And she had stuck out her hand. Harry had shaken it. They had become, by the end of the second week, in the small way of people who recognized one another across cousin distance, the kind of friends that no one in the house had quite predicted, but that the house then began, by general consensus, to arrange itself around. The third unusual thing was the cursebreaker. The cursebreaker had been arranged by Madame Bones in the second month, on the formal request of Sirius and on the informal request of Andromeda, who had reviewed the available specialists and chosen, after long thought, the one who came on the best references and the lowest professional ego. The cursebreaker was a witch named Hadis Yusuf, age 46, in the Office of Magical Ocular and Bloodline Phenomena at the Cairo branch of Gringotts. She had been seconded by the express commitment of the Cairo office to spend in the year following the awakening 4 weeks at the cottage in Wales, 1 in October, 1 in February, 1 in May, and 1 in August, to perform on Harry the standard professional assessment that had been in similar awakenings customary for the past 900 years. Hadis Yusuf was small, square-shouldered, brown-skinned, and almost embarrassingly direct. She came on her first visit in a long coat the color of a black olive and a small leather notebook the corners of which were soft from use. She sat down at the kitchen table on the 2nd of October, 1989, and said to Harry without preamble, without the standard adult condescension, in the careful, equal, scholarly voice with which she would have addressed a colleague, "Mr. Potter, I have been told that you have something my profession calls a Sharingan, that it awoke spontaneously on the 31st of July, and that the awakening went directly to the Mangekyo. I would like, if I may, to ask you to tell me, in your own words, what your eyes do. I will not in this visit ask you to demonstrate, I will only ask you to describe, may I?" "Yes," said Harry, "then begin where you like." Harry began where he liked. He spoke for 34 minutes in the small, careful, even register of a 9-year-old who had been asked, for the first time in his life, the right question by the right person. Hadis did not interrupt, she made notes. When he was done, she put her quill down, looked at him for a moment and said, "Mr. Potter, I will tell you 3 things, and then I will, by your leave, go and have a small private cry because what you have just described to me is, and I tell you this in my professional capacity, having spent 21 years doing this work for the bank, the cleanest awakening sequence I have ever heard. The first thing, you are not broken, you are intact. The second thing, the moon you saw at the moment of awakening is, in our literature, the standard moon. It is not a sign of any particular instability. Many of the Akimi descendants who have awakened report it. The third thing, I will, with your permission, take 3 of these visits to teach you in detail the operational parameters of your inherited reflex. After that, with your further permission, I will, in the 4th visit, introduce you to 2 of the supplementary techniques which you will, by then, have begun to suspect you can do." "Which 2?" Harry asked. Hadis looked at him. "You already suspect." "Yes, then say," Harry considered. he said after a moment, and with the small, careful equanimity of a child stating a hypothesis he had been forming for some weeks. I can light things on fire with my eyes. Not all things, cursed things. I have twice lit small cursed objects on fire without intending to. The first was a hex string on the doorframe of this cottage when we arrived, which Sirius did not know about and which I think was put there by someone in 1980 to keep someone out and which burned in a small black flame for about 30 seconds and then was gone. The second was a small wooden coin in a box of my father's things that Andromeda gave me. The coin was, I think, also cursed. I do not know with what. The black flame burned the coin to ash in 2 seconds. I did not in either case intend to do it. I do not in either case know how I would do it again on purpose. Hadis nodded. That, she said, is Amaterasu, or what your ancestors in Japan would have called the seedling form of Amaterasu. The fact that you have produced it twice in your first 3 months is, in my professional opinion, statistically anomalous in the upward direction. Most carriers do not produce the seedling form of Amaterasu until 2 to 3 years after Mangekyo manifestation. You produced it twice in approximately 12 weeks. I do not in saying this mean to alarm you. I mean to tell you that your bloodline, in addition to having awakened, appears to be unusually willing to be cooperative. You and your bloodline are getting on well together. The second technique, Harry hesitated. I do not know that one yet. I have a feeling sometimes that there is a third thing my eyes can do. It feels like there is a kind of a shape around me in the corner of my vision when I am very tired and very calm, and the shape is the color of clear water with the light coming through it sideways. I cannot yet see it properly. I cannot yet make it do anything. Hadis did not in the moment smile. She did, however, set her quill down very deliberately. She closed the notebook. She put her hand flat on the cover of the notebook. The way one puts a hand on the lid of a box, one is going to open more slowly than the box deserves. That, she said, is Susanoo. In English, the rough translation is something like the protector of the watcher. It is the third and most difficult of the inherited reflexes. It is also in the literature the slowest to mature. I will not today give you any further information. I will instead, on my 4th visit, with your guardian's consent, begin to introduce you very gently to the principle of holding it for a fraction of a second on purpose. Until then, and this is, please understand, the most important thing I will say to you all year, do not try. Do not in particular try when you are alone. You are 9. You are unusually clever, even for a Sharingan carrier, even for an Akimi descendant. You are not, however, ready. There is a great deal of damage you could do to yourself between today and the day on which you are ready if you make the mistake of confusing readiness with ability. Do we understand each other? Yes, said Harry. Repeat it back, please. Do not try when alone. Wait until you are ready. Readiness is not ability. Hadis nodded. She closed the leather notebook and tied the small cloth thong around it. Then, Mr. Potter, that is everything for today. Tomorrow, with your guardian's leave, I will begin to give you, for the first time, what we in this profession call instruction in iQuiet. iQuiet is what allows you to choose when the Sharingan is on and when it is off. It is, I am told, an immensely irritating skill to learn, like learning to roll your tongue on purpose when you previously did it only by accident, but it is the foundation of everything else, and you and I will work on it for the better part of a year. Are you willing? Yes. Good. She did in fact then leave the kitchen and walk out into the garden and have at the bottom of the lawn behind the herb bed a small private cry of approximately 90 seconds, during which she leaned her head against a stone wall and laughed and shook again, and was, without anyone seeing, looked at by a magpie sitting on the back fence, which inclined its head once and then with the small purposeful flight of a creature that had finished an errand left. This was the establishment in the first 3 months of Harry's training. It was, in pattern, what would continue for the next 2 3/4 years. Hadis came 4 times a year. She taught him iQuiet. She taught him after iQuiet, iClarity, which was the trick of seeing what was actually in front of him without the watching superimposing extra structural information onto it. This, she explained, was important because the watching, untrained, could exhaust the carrier's nervous system in a matter of weeks if it was never allowed to rest. She taught him, after iClarity, the deliberate control of Tsukuyomi. By April of 1990, he could enter and exit the technique at will, with 3 different gradations of duration: a long cast of 72 subjective hours, a medium cast of 12, and a short cast of 45 minutes. By August of 1990, he had practiced, on a small set of consenting adults under controlled conditions, with healer oversight, at the Office of Magical Ocular and Bloodline Phenomena in the basement of a small unmarked building near St. Pancras, the calibrated use of Tsukuyomi for non-cruel applications. Walking a willing subject through a memory of their own grandmother for 12 minutes. Permitting a healer who wished to study the technique to spend 45 subjective minutes inside the architecture of Harry's own awakening, with Harry as the guide, assisting a pensive technician in retrieving a memory that had been blocked by an obliviation. in a controlled non-coercive collaboration that the technician had later reported in writing. Had been the gentlest interaction with another person's interior I have experienced in 19 years of this work. By the time Harry was 10, he could control Tsukuyomi entirely. He could also, by Hadis's progressive instruction, kindle the small seedling Amaterasu on command. He could, with one short focused glance, ignite a small black flame on a cursed object. The flame, Hadis taught him, had 3 rules. It would not consume any object that was not in some material sense already cursed. It could not be extinguished by water or smothering. It could be extinguished, however, by the carrier's own act of looking away with conscious intent. Harry practiced. He practiced on dozens of cursed objects supplied, with Gringotts' Cairo permission, from Hadis's professional reserve of confiscated artifacts. He learned to burn a hex medallion in 5 seconds. He learned to burn a dark-marked playing card in 2 seconds. He learned, after some practice, to burn a cursed object the size of a small book in approximately 90 seconds, although this took out of him, by the end, a small reservoir of strength that required 20 minutes of stillness to refill. By the time Harry was almost 11, in the early summer of 1991, Hadis on her 6th visit had finally introduced him to the principle of holding Susanoo for a fraction of a second on purpose. He had managed, on her first prompt, 3/10 of a second of what she called rib-form Susanoo, a faint blue-clear translucent curve like the inside surface of a glass bell surrounding his right forearm. He had managed, by the end of the visit, 2.5 seconds. He had managed, by the end of the summer, 10 seconds. He had managed, on the day he received his Hogwarts letter, 14 seconds of a clearly visible blade of light extending about 6 inches past the front edge of his right wrist. Hadis, after that, had said only, "You are ready, Mr. Potter. Do not, for the love of every god any one of us has ever had, push it further until I tell you to push it further. We will in your 11th year reach a foot." Yes, Hadis, and Mr. Potter. Yes, you are doing extremely well. This was in 3 years the only direct compliment Hadis Yusuf would ever pay Harry James Potter, and he understood it for what it was and kept it. What is harder in this period to describe in any orderly account is what was happening to Harry as a person. He was, when he arrived at the cottage in Wales, a 9-year-old who had been for 9 years very small. He was not, and Andromeda and Ted, in particular, watching him with the patient eyes of 2 people who had raised a metamorph Magus daughter, were the first to observe this, going to be small forever. He was, in fact, between September of 1989 and June of 1991, going to grow approximately 6 inches in height. He was going to put on a stone and 3 pounds. His hair, which had been a thin, chaotic black, was going to thicken and acquire the small, particular shine of a hair that was being washed with regularity for the first time in living memory. His teeth, which had been improperly straight only because Petunia had refused to take him to a Muggle dentist, were going to be examined by a wizarding dental specialist named Edna Cravenly, who was going to recommend a 6-month course of dental charm correction during which Harry was, on a daily basis, to bite for 10 seconds on a small magical chew stick that smelled, by a small accident of the manufacturing process, exactly like peppermint. He was going to grow into his eyes, which had been the 2nd largest feature of his face in 9 years, and were going to be, by the time he was 11, only one feature among several. He was also going to learn, slowly, the small social arts. Andromeda would teach him in the first 6 months that it was acceptable at a kitchen table to ask for the salt. She would teach him in the second 6 months that it was acceptable when one had finished to put one's plate in the sink without asking. She would teach him in the third 6 months that it was acceptable when offered a second helping to say yes if one wanted it. None of these were small. He had been, in the previous 9 years, taught the opposite of each in the most direct possible way. He learned them slowly with the patient attention of a child who understood that learning small social arts was a kind of inheritance that had been withheld from him and was now being restored, and who was, in a small private register, grateful for the restoration. He did not say so. He did, however, by the end of the 2nd year, ask for the salt without flinching. Andromeda kept her composure about this, because Andromeda kept her composure about most things, but Ted, on the relevant evening at dinner after Harry had asked for the salt, "Please could you pass the salt, Andromeda?" had to leave the table briefly on a small pretext and had come back 2 minutes later with very red eyes. Sirius, in this period, did the slow, patient work of becoming, in stages, the godfather he had told the bench he intended to be. He did this, by his own assessment, badly at first. He was, in the first 3 months, more like a large, friendly, sometimes erratic older cousin than a guardian. He did not know what to do when Harry had a nightmare, he learned. He did not know what to do when Harry refused in the 2nd month to eat dinner because the dinner had carrots in it. He sat down across from Harry, looked at the carrots, looked at Harry and said, "I had to eat carrots in Azkaban once," It is one of the things I would prefer never to do again. May I have your carrots? And he had eaten them. Harry had eaten the rest of his dinner. They had not since that night served carrots at the cottage in Wales. Sirius had cleared this small adjustment with Andromeda by a single nod across the kitchen. 3 nights later, while Harry was upstairs reading. He did not know what to do in the third month when Harry, who had for 9 years been a child who never spoke unless spoken to, turned to him one evening at the chessboard and asked in a small, careful voice, "Did you love my mother?" Sirius had not in advance prepared an answer for that question. He had, however, prepared the principle of all the answers he would give to questions he had not prepared for, which was that he would tell the truth as fully as he was able. He set down the bishop he was holding. He looked at Harry. He said in a voice that was slow but was not strained, "Yes, pup, not romantically. As a friend, I loved her as a friend. I loved her also in a slightly less easy to describe way that I will, when you are older, try to explain better. The short version is, she made the room more interesting. I had not in my whole life before her been in a room with anyone who made the room more interesting. I have been since her in rooms with other people who do, but she was the first. She is also, I want you to know, and this is the part I came back from prison to say to you, the second bravest person I ever met. Your father was the first. I will, by the time you are older, have many other small things to tell you about both of them. I am happy when you are ready to tell you all of them. May I tell you one tonight? Yes, your mother once, when she was 16, with one stinging hex and a single thoughtful sentence, persuaded the entire 7th-year Slytherin Quidditch team to stop, for the rest of the season, calling another student a word that is not used in this house. The word does not need to be repeated. The persuasion lasted, by my count, the rest of the year. She did it without telling anyone she had done it. She did it without my knowing she had done it, until I overheard a Slytherin describe the conversation in horrified retrospect to 2 of his friends. She did not in her entire life take credit for this. I am telling you now so that someone in your generation knows. Harry had at the chessboard considered this for a moment. He had nodded very slightly. He had said, "Thank you, that is helpful." He had not in the months that followed asked Sirius another question that was as hard as that one. He had, however, gradually in small, careful increments asked many. By the end of the first year, Sirius had told him perhaps 120 separate small stories about his parents, about Lily's laugh, about James's particular way of mispronouncing the word espionage, about the fact that his father had been allergic to oranges, about the fact that his mother had owned, briefly in 1980, a pet rat named Brian, of whom she had been embarrassed and whom she had named Brian on the express logic that if anyone asks me his name, I will not be able to say it without laughing, and laughter is the right way to talk about pets. About the fact that his father had once made his mother a paper crane on an afternoon when she had been crying, although Sirius could not remember why she had been crying because he said honestly he had not been entirely sober that afternoon, but the crane had worked and she had stopped crying, and she had kept the crane in her purse for years afterward, even at school. Harry had received this last detail with the small attentive stillness he reserved for facts that he understood, by some inner instinct, to be important. He had not in the moment told Sirius why. He would much later in his 4th year of Hogwarts, at a kitchen table back at the cottage in Wales, finally tell him about the paper crane on the windowsill in Petunia's country, and about Akimi, and about the inheritance, and about the fact that the crane had been, in some way Harry did not fully understand, the centerpiece of every Tsukuyomi he had ever cast. Sirius, on hearing this, would put down his teacup and say very quietly, "Right, of course it was." Andromeda in this period was the household's quiet center. She was the one who every morning was first downstairs. She was the one who in the second week had quietly removed every shoe cupboard in the house and replaced them by a single brisk Saturday morning expansion charm with proper open shelves on which it was impossible by physical design to put a child. She was the one who in the 3rd week had taken Harry shopping for clothes that fit. She was the one who, when Harry in the 4th week had asked her quietly whether it was acceptable by the house's rules for him to leave the bedroom door slightly open at night because he had not slept in a room with an open door since he was 4, had said, "Yes, you may leave the door however you wish, always, the door is yours," and had not in the rest of his time in the house ever closed it for him. Ted, in this period, taught Harry chess in increasingly serious increments. Ted, by the end of the 2nd year, was no longer winning against Harry. He had not yet, at the start of the 3rd, told Harry this out of pride. He played Harry to a draw, increasingly with greater and greater frequency, and Harry, who saw the small reluctance to admit it without needing the watching for the purpose, politely permitted Ted to continue not admitting it. They had a quiet understanding by Harry's 11th birthday that the proper formulation in the household was Ted and Harry played a long game last night after dinner and it ended in a draw, even when by board position it had not. Ted, on the day Harry was leaving for Hogwarts, would look him in the eye and say, "Pup, you have been beating me for a year, you did not have to be that polite. But I appreciate it." And Harry would say, with the small grave courtesy he had inherited from somebody he could not quite place, Ted, I have learned more from those games than I will from any class I ever sit in. They were not wasted on me. And Ted would, at this, do exactly what he had done at the salt-passing dinner, which was to leave the room briefly on a small pretext and come back with red eyes. Nymphadora, Tonks in this period, did the work of being the slightly older cousin Harry had never had and would, by the end of the 3 years, never not have. She showed him in the first month the small particular trick of changing the color of his eyelashes on purpose, which she could do because she was a metamorph magus and which he could do because his sharing in, by some side effect of its operation, included a small surplus of pigmentary control over his own ocular region. They spent, on a slow Saturday afternoon in November of 1989, 2 hours making each other's eyelashes go through every color in the visible spectrum. And Harry laughed so hard at one point that he gave himself a small case of hiccups. Andromeda, hearing this from the hall, had stood at the kitchen door for perhaps 90 seconds and listened, and had then very quietly, without entering, returned to what she was doing. She had not that evening spoken about it. She had, however, written a small note about it in the back of a kitchen ledger she kept for her own private accounting, where she had written on the date of the hiccups. He laughed, real, full, undefended laugh, 6 minutes, the first since he came here. She had underlined the word 6 twice. By the second year, the laughs were no longer an event one needed to underline. By the third year, they were a regular feature of the kitchen. Sometimes Sirius's joke, sometimes Tonks's impression of an aura trainer, sometimes Ted's poor attempt at a Welsh accent sometimes, and these were the funniest, although it would take Sirius until the second summer to admit it, Harry's own small dry observations, which he produced rarely but with the small confident timing of a child who had spent many years watching adult conversation from the outside and had developed, by virtue of that watching, a very accurate sense of where the small comedies of human life were located. There was, in this period, also a visitor. The visitor came once in the autumn of 1990 in October. The visitor was a man named Remus Lupin, who Sirius had not since 1981 been on speaking terms with, although the not speaking had not been a matter of grievance on either side, only of circumstance and absence and grief, and who arrived by Sirius's invitation on a wet Thursday afternoon with a small carpet bag and a slightly cautious expression that softened when he stepped into the kitchen into a small, uncomplicated smile. He was 40. He looked older. He had the small, careful posture of a man who had spent a number of years trying not to take up the space that, by long internal habit, he believed he did not deserve. He stayed 3 nights. He played on the second evening a game of exploding snap with Harry. He let Harry win, which was a thing Harry, by the new red eyes, registered, and which Harry, on consideration, decided not to mention because it was the kindest sort of letting. On the third night, he sat on the front porch with Sirius for 2 hours and they spoke, in the small, careful, low voices of 2 people who had loved the same dead people and had been alone with the grief, separately, for a long time, and there is no record of what they said because Andromeda, when she came to call them in for supper, had quietly turned around at the door and gone back inside and let them stay there until they were ready. Remus did not, on this visit, come with any plan to be a permanent member of the household. He was a defense against the dark arts teacher in a Muggle community college on the South Coast, and was, when not in classroom or library, in a small flat. He came twice more in the 3 years. He came at Christmas of 1990 and at Easter of 1991. He sent letters. He sent, in particular, on Harry's 10th and 11th birthdays, a small careful note each year. The notes were never long, were never sentimental, were the kind of notes one sends to a child whose company one has decided one likes, and these notes Harry kept folded in a small wooden box on the windowsill of his bedroom in the position previously occupied at number 4 by Wednesday the spider egg sack. He had brought Wednesday with him to Wales, by the way. He had asked Madame Bones in the 3rd week whether the relevant constabulary in Surrey would mind if his Auror friends sent him the small detached piece of cupboard corner with the egg sack on it. Madame Bones had not, at the request, even raised an eyebrow. She had simply written, in her flat grocery list voice, an order for retrieval. Tonks, who had supervised the original cataloging of the cupboard's contents, had personally carried the piece of cupboard corner up the back stair, into the cottage, on the morning of the 3rd week, in a small wooden box. Harry had taken the box upstairs. He had placed it in the corner of his bedroom on a low shelf, where the spider egg sack had remained untouched for the next year. It had eventually, in the autumn of 1990, hatched. Tonks had been there for the hatching. By happy accident, she had come up for a weekend and had, with her own metamorphic trained patience, helped Harry catch the small 38 resultant spiderlings in glass jars and had, at sundown, walked them out into the backwood with Harry, and they had together very gently released them. They were ordinary spiderlings. They were not magical. They were small. They were perfectly viable. They scattered into the undergrowth in 38 different careful directions. Tonks had said only, "Cousin, that was a friend you kept very well." Harry had said only, "Thank you, he was." In the small wooden box on the windowsill after the hatching, Harry placed 3 other objects. He placed the small leather-framed photograph Sirius had given him on the day Sirius arrived. He placed Remus's notes. And he placed, after a long Sunday afternoon of consideration, a single small piece of folded yellowed paper, a paper crane which he had folded by patient self-instruction from a book Andromeda had brought him from the wizarding paper-folding section of Flourish and Blots with his own hands. The crane had taken him 3 afternoons. It was, on inspection, not a particularly excellent crane. It was, however, his. He had decided in the second afternoon of the folding that the crane was for his great-grandmother. He had not said this aloud. He had not in fact known, on the start of the first afternoon, why he had decided to fold a crane at all. He had only known, with the small, precise instinct of a Sheringan carrier who was now, in his second year of Haddis's instruction, beginning to understand his own bloodline in a more concrete way, that the crane was a thing he was supposed to have folded by now, and that the folding was a kind of arriving. When he placed the crane in the box on the windowsill, on the relevant Sunday afternoon in the autumn of 1990, he stood for a moment in front of the box with his hands in his pockets and looked at the crane. He did not speak. He nodded once. He turned very slowly and went back downstairs, where Sirius was making, with the air of a man performing a small private rebellion against his entire childhood, a pot of Earl Grey with milk, in a teapot Andromeda had inherited from her Aunt Walburga. By the time the Hogwarts letter arrived, on the morning of Harry's 11th birthday, July the 31st, 1991, the cottage in Wales had in 3 years slowly and patiently rewritten Harry James Potter into something much closer to the shape of a child than the shape of a survivor. He was still, by the new red eyes, a person with the capacity for a country of his own. He was still, by the small, careful chest pocket of every cardigan he owned, the carrier of a folded crane. He had also, by ordinary practice, learned to ask for the salt, to laugh in the kitchen, to leave his bedroom door open by choice rather than by necessity, to play chess as black on alternate days, and to receive without flinching, without the watching's instinctive defensive reach, a hand on his shoulder from a person who loved him. The Hogwarts letter arrived by owl at 6:23 in the morning. Andromeda was in the kitchen, having been up for half an hour. She heard the owl. She opened the window, she received the letter. She did not in the moment deliver it to Harry. She put the letter instead in the center of the kitchen table on a small square of folded linen. She put a small vase of late roses next to it. She lit the kitchen lamp, although the kitchen was already in morning light. She sat down at the table opposite the empty chair and she waited. Harry came down at 6:50. He looked at the table. He looked at Andromeda. He sat down. He picked up the letter. He read it. He folded it. He set it back down. He said, "Andromeda. Yes, it's come. Yes, love, it has. May I keep the envelope? You may keep all of it." He nodded. He sat for a moment in the morning quiet of the kitchen, with the late roses in the vase next to him and his hand flat on the folded letter. And he thought very simply of his mother, of the woman in the air to his left of the hallway at number 4 2 years ago, who had cupped her hand at the side of his face for 2 seconds. And he thought that today was the first morning of his life on which he was, in the small administrative sense, entering the world she had wanted him to enter. He thought of his father, he thought of Sirius asleep upstairs, he thought of Remus in his small flat on the south coast. He thought of Haddis in Cairo, who would, when she heard the news, raise her glass of mint tea to nothing in particular and say, "Mr. Potter," once in a steady voice. He thought of Madame Bones at her desk in London, who would receive a small note from Andromeda by the noon owl post, and would, without any visible reaction, nod once and continue with her work. He thought last of the cupboard under the stairs at number 4. He thought of Wednesday the spider egg sack, who was now in 38 pieces somewhere in the wood behind the cottage. He thought of the small honor guard of broken plastic soldiers, which Tonks had personally placed in their labeled box in the back of his wardrobe upstairs, where they had for 2 years watched him sleep. He stood up, he walked around the table. He put his arms around Andromeda's neck from behind very lightly, the way a child puts his arms around an adult he is not in the moment asking for anything from. He held the small embrace for the length of 2 breaths, then he let go. He said, "Thank you," she said, "for what, love? For everything." He went upstairs to wake Sirius. By the time he came back down, the kitchen was full. Ted had come in. Tonks had apparated for breakfast, as she did every Sunday. The letter was being passed around the table. Sirius was holding it with the small, careful hand of a man holding for the first time a thing he had been imagining for 9 years. He looked across the table at his godson. He did not in the moment say anything. He held the letter up. He nodded. Harry nodded back. In the small wooden box on the windowsill upstairs, the folded crane sat in the morning light and was, in the way of inherited objects, watching. Outside the kitchen window on the small back lawn, a magpie crossed the grass once low, and this time with the small accumulated practice of 3 years, it landed on the back porch railing, settled, tucked 1 foot up and stayed. Chapter 7, Hogwarts Year 1 King's Cross Station on the 1st of September 1991 was a particular gauntlet. There was the small mechanical bustle of Muggle commuters with their newspapers and their plastic shopping bags and their professionally indifferent eyes. There was the slightly larger and slightly more bewildered bustle of wizarding families pretending to be Muggle commuters, with their newly purchased Muggle tartan trolleys and their newly flattened Muggle-style hair and their tendency, by long household habit, to walk a half-step too far apart from one another on the platforms because they had spent the morning packing under broom protection charms and had not yet remembered to walk like ordinary people. There was, in addition, on this particular morning, the small additional press of about 30 wizarding journalists, of whom approximately 28 were operating under the assumption that the small unnamed boy who would shortly attempt to push a trolley through the barrier between platforms 9 and 10 was the small unnamed boy they had all been quietly preparing column inches about for the past 2 years. The journalists were correct in their assumption. They were, however, in a position so disadvantageous that the inaccuracy of their preparation was not, on the day, going to matter. This was because Madame Bones, 3 weeks before the 1st of September, had quietly issued an internal departmental instruction to the effect that the platform, both Muggle platform and Magical platform, would, on the morning in question, be temporarily warded by 2 senior aurors, with the explicit purpose that any unauthorized photograph taken on or near the boundary would, by a particular legitimately licensed minor charm, immediately develop into a perfectly clear image of the photographer's own elderly grandmother on a beach at Bognor Regis in 1962, regardless of the actual subject of the photograph. The reason for choosing this particular result was that it was simultaneously embarrassing, harmless, and impossible to publish. Harry on the platform, accompanied by Sirius and Andromeda and Tonks, and by a small last-minute kindness Remus, did not see the journalists. He saw instead the steady cargo-gray current of their chakra in the small wretched motion of trained suspicion that he had over 3 years learned to recognize at a distance. He saw also the 2 aurors, whom he recognized by the small steady patient gold of their working readiness. He saw in particular the small additional gauze of disorientation charm wash that was on the air of the platform the auror's visible signature. He understood the entire architecture in approximately 4 seconds. He turned his head slightly toward Sirius. He said in a low voice, "She arranged for the journalists not to be a problem." "Yes," said Sirius also in a low voice. "It is kind. It is, she is. Thank her for me." "I will." Harry pushed his trolley with Hedwig in her cage on the top. Hedwig had been a gift from Haddis Yusuf on the occasion of his 11th birthday, accompanied by a small note that said only, "An owl, Mr. Potter, is by ancient bloodline practiced the correct companion for a Sheringan carrier in his first decade of operation. This one chose you. She is well-tempered. Do not ever lie to her." Through the barrier between platforms 9 and 10 and entered platform 9 and 3/4 with the small, careful breath of a child arriving, finally, in the country his mother had wanted him to enter. Sirius hugged him. Andromeda kissed his forehead. Tonks ruffled his hair, although it did not need ruffling because Tonks did not consider a goodbye complete without an unsanctioned ruffle. Remus last put his hand on Harry's shoulder very briefly with the small contained warmth of a man who had not in many years expected to be the godfather-adjacent uncle of a child going off to Hogwarts, and who was in the moment finding the experience moving in a way he had not adequately prepared for. He said only, "Pup, right." Harry said, "Yes, Uncle Remus." The 4 of them on the platform stood back. Harry boarded the train. He found in the 3rd carriage from the front an empty compartment. He stowed Hedwig. He stowed his trunk. He sat down in the seat by the window facing forward. He waved out the window. They waved back. The train, with the small grand mechanical dignity it had been performing since 1879, pulled out of King's Cross at exactly 11 o'clock. The journey north took the standard 7.5 hours. He was joined in the first hour by a red-haired boy who introduced himself as Ron Weasley, and who, after a small interval of polite chatter, asked, with the small unembarrassed honesty of his particular family, whether the rumor was true. Harry, who had been told to expect the question, had prepared a small, careful answer. He said, "Some of the rumors are true, most aren't. I'd rather, if you don't mind, not be the rumor today. Today I would just like to be Harry and to meet you. Is that all right?" Ron, who had been raised by Molly Weasley and who therefore knew by deep household training what the small magic word for the establishment of a friendship was, had said, "Yes, that's all right with me," and had then offered by way of household exchange a chocolate frog. Harry had taken it. They had eaten chocolate frogs for 40 minutes and had spoken. in the small, careful, expanding way of two boys who were each unusually interested in the other but did not want to seem as though they were, about Quidditch teams, about chess, about Ron's older brothers. There were apparently 5 of them, of whom one was in the immediate family of dragons in Romania and one was already a Gringotts cursebreaker working in Egypt, and Harry, on hearing this, had said in a tone he could not quite keep flat, "In Egypt, Cairo office?" And Ron had said yes, and Harry had asked the name, and Ron had said Bill, and Harry had said only, "I think your brother probably knows my cursebreaker. I'll write to him." And Ron had blinked in the way an 11-year-old blinks when he has just been told that he has a cursebreaker but had elected by polite household training not to ask. In the second hour, the compartment door slid open and a bushy-haired girl with prominent front teeth, these were going, in fact, to be improved by the same Edna Cravenly who had done Harry's by a small, unintentional accident of timing in 4th year, leaned in to ask whether anyone had seen a toad. They had not. The bushy-haired girl introduced herself as Hermione Granger. She was, by her own immediate self-description, the daughter of 2 dentists, the reader of every relevant textbook for the upcoming year, and a little nervous, although I shouldn't be because nervousness is irrational without information and I have the information. Harry, who had recognized her by the new red eyes as a person who would in the next 7 years be either the second or third most important friend of his life depending on outcome, said in a steady voice, "It is reasonable to be nervous." "I am nervous too. Please sit down if you would like." She sat down, they spoke. Ron, by the 3rd hour, was overcoming his initial wariness of her and beginning to like her. By the 4th, she had successfully assisted in retrieving the toad, which had been by good unguarded fortune in the next compartment along. In the 5th hour, the door opened a 3rd time. A pale, sharp-faced boy in good robes stood in it, flanked by 2 larger boys who did not appear to be there of their own initiative, and said in the small, careful, inherited voice of a household that had been training him for this introduction since he was 4, "I'm told Harry Potter is in this compartment. Is that you?" Harry, by the small, careful courtesy he had spent 3 years building, said, "Yes, I'm Harry, and you?" "Malfoy, Draco Malfoy." There was, in the doorway, a small, private second of pause. The pause was the small, careful awareness, visible only to Harry by the new red eyes of 3 boys' worth of overlapping family pressures, of which Draco's was the most acute by the largest single margin. Harry saw with the precise watching the slight uncertain tilt of Draco's mouth, the slightly too confident set of the small shoulders, the small careful chakra running thin at the breastbone, the way it does when an 11-year-old has been told all morning that he is to make a good first impression and has not, by the standards of the family delivering the instruction, ever in his life been allowed to relax. Harry saw the entire conversational architecture of the next 90 seconds in the first half of the first second. He saw in particular the small specific sentence Draco had been instructed to deliver, which would, by its delivery, have made it impossible for Harry and Draco to be anything other than antagonists for 7 years. Harry, with the small, careful precision of a person who had spent 3 years learning to choose, made a choice. He smiled. The smile was not large. It was, in fact, the smallest possible polite smile. He said, "Draco, hello, would you like to come in?" Draco was caught. He had not, at the threshold of the door, been planning to come in. He had been planning by his instructions to make his short scripted offer to Harry that he could help him distinguish in the wizarding world between the right sort of people and the wrong sort, and he had been planning by the script to expect his offer to be either accepted or refused and to have in either case a small portable response. He had not been planning to be invited in. He paused. He very slightly glanced at the 2 larger boys. He very slightly looked back at Harry. "All right," he said. He came in. He sat down with the small, careful arrangement of robes of a person who had been taught how to sit since he was 4. The 2 larger boys, by some unspoken instruction, did not come in. They stood, half confused, in the corridor. Draco said after a beat, "I was supposed to." "Yes," said Harry. "I know what you were supposed to. I do not think we should do it. I think we should instead talk for a little while as 4 people about to be at the same school. You may have noticed that I have, in the small accidental fact of my eyes, a feature that may, by some commentary I am sure you have already heard, be the source of certain rumors. May I tell you the truth about it before someone else tells you a lie?" Draco, who was, even his family's training notwithstanding, 11 years old and a person, said slowly, "Yes." Harry told him in 2 short paragraphs the small public version of what his eyes did. He did not in the telling condescend, he did not flinch. He did not, by long careful practice, allow the watching to flare in any visible way at the conversation's tense moments. He spoke to Draco Malfoy in the small back compartment of the Hogwarts Express, in exactly the voice he had spoken to Madame Bones on the parquet of number 4 2 years before. Calm, steady, not particularly cool, and entirely respectful of the listener's intelligence. Draco, by the end of the second paragraph, was looking at Harry with an expression Harry had not, in any of the 3 years since the awakening seen before and which he recognized only by inference. The expression was, I have been told my whole life that the world is one way, and I am now, by direct contact with one of the things in the world I was told about, beginning to suspect that the world may in fact be a different way. It was an expression that, by the end of 7 years at Hogwarts, would not entirely settle on Draco's face. The set of it, however, would change. The change would matter. In the moment, Draco said only, I see. Would you like to stay? I think I had better not. All right, but Potter, yes, you will perhaps at some point during the year sit with me at breakfast once. All right, Draco nodded very slightly. He left. He did not on his way out give Ron the small contemptuous look his family training would have prescribed. He did not on his way out look at Hermione at all. He left, and the two larger boys followed him, and the compartment door slid shut. Ron breathed out, Blimey, Harry. How did you do that? Practice? At what? Choosing? Hermione, who had been watching the entire exchange with the small, alert attention of a person who would in 7 years write 3 theses on the precise sociological mechanisms by which children of the British wizarding aristocracy were shaped into adults, said only, Harry, that was the kindest thing I have ever seen a stranger do for another stranger, thank you. Harry blinked. You are welcome. The train continued. In the 6th hour, the rain began. The rain fell in thin, steady wash across the windows of the carriages. The compartment grew dim. The conversation lapsed. Ron for a while snored. Hermione, with a small lantern and a book of charms, read. Harry by the window looked out at the country going past, more than forest, then more, and let his eyes rest. He let the watching settle. He let the slow, steady humming attentiveness of the Sheringan retreat to a low watchfire at the back of his head where it could be drawn forward when needed, but where it would not until needed drink at his strength. He had learned in 3 years that this was the most important small skill any carrier could practice, the skill of letting the eyes rest. He had been an quiet apprentice for the better part of 2 years. He was now, at 11, a small-grade journeyman. He let himself in the rain in the dim carriage be an 11-year-old going to school for the first time. He thought briefly of his mother. He thought of his father. He thought of the cottage in Wales, of Sirius asleep upstairs in the early morning, of Andromeda's hand on the back of his neck the previous evening as she had said goodnight, of Tonk's last small hair ruffle on the platform, of Remus's hand on his shoulder. He thought of the cupboard under the stairs at number 4. The thought was today small. It was no longer the heavy granite shelf at the back of his mind that it had been 2 years before. It was now only a small private thought, like the memory of a tunnel through which one has, by accident, passed. The cupboard did not today hurt. He registered with the small clean accountancy he had inherited from somebody he was not sure of that the not hurting was a thing he had earned slowly by the patient 3-year care of 4 adults and a metamorph Magus cousin, and that the not hurting was also a small portable benefit he had no intention of forgetting. He thought last of the stone. He had read in his mother's letter there had been one, found in a wardrobe at the Tonks' cottage in 1990 in a coat that had once belonged to Lily Evans before her wedding, addressed to Sirius, sealed and unopened in a small inside pocket, which Sirius had wept reading and had then, with the small dignity of a man who had decided what to do with it, given to Harry on Harry's 10th birthday, that there were in the world certain objects whose presence at Hogwarts in any given year would be a sign that the school was, that year, in a particular and unusual kind of danger. The letter named 4 such objects. The Philosopher's Stone was one. The stone had, in the months before Harry's 11th birthday, been moved out of a bank vault and into a school. By a particular decision of the headmaster of Hogwarts, this fact had been quietly noted by Madame Bones's office in the 3rd week of July. And Madame Bones, with the steady, careful diligence she had brought to every part of this case for 3 years, had sent a private letter to Harry, and only to Harry, not to Sirius, by way of small public trust between them, informing him of the move. And informing him that she did not, in her professional capacity, intend to interfere with the headmaster's decision, because the headmaster was, in this jurisdiction, within his rights, but she wanted Harry to know. Harry had written back on the same evening a short note. The note had said, "Thank you, I will watch. If something occurs, I will write, Harry." He thought of the stone now on the train with the rain across the windows. He thought, with the small precise wariness he had been carrying for 2 months, that something was, on present trajectory, going to occur and that he was going to be one of the people in a position to see it. He had decided 2 months before that this would be acceptable. He had decided in particular that he was not going to seek the stone out, because his great-grandmother's posthumous instruction by way of Haddis Yusuf had been very clear about not seeking trouble in one's first year of school, but that if trouble found him, he would meet it. The rain continued. The train arrived at Hogsmeade Station at 6:28 in the evening, 10 minutes behind schedule on account of leaves on the line. The lake crossing in the boats was, by long Hogwarts tradition, a small theatrical introduction. Harry, in a boat with Ron, Hermione, and a small pale boy named Neville Longbottom, did not particularly notice the theater. He noticed with the watching half on at the lake's surface that the lake was layered. that there was perhaps 30 feet below them a small population of merpeople going about their evening, that there were in the deeper water 3 different species of underwater plant arranged by territoriality, with one of them, a small dark kelp-like growth, glowing very faintly in the corner of his peripheral vision in the unmistakable signature of an old curse rooted somewhere in the silt. He did not in the moment point at it, he noted it, he filed it. He resolved, by the time the boat arrived at the small underground dock, to ask Hagrid about it later in the term. Hagrid would, when asked, scratch his head and say, "Aye, that's been there since the 1760s. Nasty bit o' work, we let it alone, we have a small treaty with it." Harry would, on hearing this, decide in his small careful interior to let it alone too. The lake was not this year his problem. Inside the castle, the sorting was conducted with the standard Hogwarts mixture of solemnity, ceremony, and small unrehearsed comedy. Harry stood with the first years in the long line. He waited his turn. He noted around him the steady ambient chakra of 900 children, 3 dozen teachers, 4 ghosts, and 1 extremely old hat. The hat had, by his watching, the deep, low, slow chakra of an object that had been in continuous magical operation for 923 years. He had not previously in his life observed an object of such age and continuous use. He found the observation pleasant. He looked at the hat with the small, careful courtesy he reserved for things older than him by an order of magnitude or more. Then the small witch with the parchment scroll said his name, and the great hall went quiet, and Harry walked to the stool and sat down, and the hat was lowered onto his head, and the watching very politely did not initiate any interaction with the older intelligence underneath the hat that was now beginning, slowly and rigorously, to consider him. The hat said in the small, high old voice it used inside the wearer's head. "Ah." Harry waited. "Ah," said the hat, "the Akimi line." "Yes," said Harry in his head. "Plus," said the hat, "other things I see." "Ah, yes, yes." The hat was by long professional practice not in a hurry. It read for, by the senior teacher's clock, approximately 55 seconds. The great hall behind Harry did not breathe. The hat finished reading. It said only one sentence aloud. "Is that see truth, Slytherin?" The great hall did not in the moment gasp. The great hall, when in formal ceremony, did not gasp. Gasping was reserved for unscripted moments, and the sorting, despite being unscripted on the page, was scripted in the social register. The great hall instead, and this was, by long professional practice of the Hogwarts ceremonial system, the formal equivalent of a gasp, adjusted its sleeves. Approximately 300 children and 3 dozen adults in unison made the very small unconscious shift to their robe cuffs that constituted, by formal Hogwarts protocol, the appropriate ceremonial registration of a surprise. There was behind Harry the small dry sound of a great deal of cloth shifting at once. Then the silence resumed. Harry, with the small calm dignity of a child who had decided 2 months before that he would be unbothered by whichever house took him, took the hat off, stood up, and walked to the Slytherin table. A small lithe boy with white blonde hair, 3 seats down at the table, did not look up at him. The boy did, however, raise his right hand from where it had been resting on the tablecloth, by the smallest possible courteous fraction, in the small private hand signal of a child who had been raised in a particular kind of household, and was in the moment registering that the new arrival had previously, on a train in a small back compartment, performed an unprecedented kindness for him. Harry sat down. He did not in the moment return the signal. He sat in the empty seat that had been left for him at the head of the first-year section, and he placed his small folded hands on the table, and he looked very steadily at the carved wooden surface in front of him, and he waited for the next first year to be sorted. The next first year was Ron Weasley. Ron went to Gryffindor. Harry, at the Slytherin table, watched him walk past in the small, straight-backed, nervous gait of a boy who had been raised to know which table he was supposed to go to, and was now slightly relieved he had made it. As Ron passed, Harry, without raising his head, lifted his hand very slightly from the wood of the Slytherin table in the smallest possible polite acknowledgement. Ron, by some small extra sensitive Weasley instinct, returned it. They had not in passing exchanged a word. They had, however, in the small acknowledgement, performed the entire next 7 years of friendship across houses in 1/2 second of mutual nod. Hermione went to Gryffindor a moment later. She too paused on her way past the Slytherin table, perhaps half a step longer than she had intended. She did not, in the moment, do anything visible. She did, however, the next morning, by an unsanctioned route through the library stacks, leave a small folded note for Harry on the Slytherin reading table, a note that said only in her clean schoolgirl print, "We are still friends." Harry would, on finding it, fold it once, smile to himself with the small, private, courteous smile of an 11-year-old whose new friends had, against all institutional currents, decided to remain his friends, and slip it into the inside pocket of his cardigan, where it would remain for the next 4 months. The rest of the term ran, by long Hogwarts practice, on its own internal clock. Harry was a quiet first year. He was, in particular classes, very good. He was, in potions, the student Professor Snape did not, on the first day, know what to do with. Snape on the first day had walked into the dungeon at the standard severe Snape pace, had glanced over the class, had stopped for by the recollection of the students present 3/4 of 1 full second at Harry, and had then resumed at the standard pace, and had begun the standard severe Snape lecture. He had not, however, called Harry's name from the roll in the standard severe Snape manner. He had read it, and then instead of looking at Harry as he read it, he had looked at his own quill. He had not at any point in the first lesson made any cutting remark. He had not at any point in the first month made any cutting remark. He would, in fact, in the entire 7 years of Harry's tenure at Hogwarts, never speak to Harry James Potter in the cutting tone he had used for 10 years previously on every other Potter-shaped child who had been put in front of him. He would instead, gradually, by small careful increments, the kind of careful increments a man uses when he is making a private apology to a person who does not know that an apology is being made, teach Harry potions with the small, precise patience he had previously reserved only for Slytherin students with strong family connections. He would, by the end of 4th year, in a private detention assigned to Harry for a small, low-stakes infraction that Harry had not in fact committed but had elected, by small private courtesy, to accept the blame for in order to give Snape an excuse to invite him to brew alone in the lab, brew a complicated potion alongside Harry in companionable silence, and at the end of the brew set down his ladle, look at Harry across the cauldron and say, "Mr. Potter, I owe your mother an apology. I cannot give it to her, I am in lieu going to give it to you. Will you receive it?" And Harry, with the new red eyes, with the watching at the watchfire of his head, with the small accumulated dignity of a child who had not, in 11 years of his life before that moment, been formally apologized to by an adult who had inherited a debt to him, would say, "Yes, Professor, I will." And Snape would deliver the apology, and Harry would accept it, and they would, in the small, steady increments of the rest of Harry's school career, slowly become, to the universal surprise of every member of the Hogwarts faculty, except Albus Dumbledore, who claimed with some careful precision to have predicted it, colleagues, that was years off. In the first year, in the first term, Harry was quiet, polite, and watching. He attended his classes. He performed at the very respectable but not at all flashy upper third of his class in most subjects, and at the silent top of 1 or 2 of them, charms in particular because Flitwick was a teacher who understood about quiet brilliance, and astronomy because Aurora Sinistra had a soft spot for any child who had in his own time learned to read stars. Played on the 3rd week of term in the small, low-stakes Slytherin first-year Quidditch tryouts, and was not by his own choice selected, although the captain, a 6th year named Marcus Flint, had said to him very quietly afterwards in the corridor, "Potter, I want you on the team next year, make me make it next year, don't make me ask you twice." And Harry, who had not in 3 years of growing up decided whether he wanted to play Quidditch, had said only, "I will think about it, Marcus." And Marcus, by long understanding of the careful way a Slytherin first year answered a question, had taken the answer as a soft yes and had not pressed him. He wrote every Sunday a letter to Sirius. He wrote every other Sunday a letter to Andromeda. He wrote once a month a letter to Remus. He wrote on the 3rd Sunday of every month a small careful note to Madame Bones in which he reported anything he thought she might wish to know. He did not, until the 2nd week of October, report anything substantive. In the 2nd week of October he reported in a 4-line note, "Madame Bones, I have observed Professor Quirrell. I do not, in the new ocular sense, like what I see. The chakra at the back of his head is wrong. There is a second presence. I am noting it for the record. I am not today intervening, Harry." Madame Bones had written back by return owl, "Mr. Potter, thank you, continue to observe, do not alone engage, keep me apprised. AB through October, November, December, January, February, and the first half of March, Harry continued to observe. He watched Professor Quirrell at every meal. He watched him in the corridor. He watched him in defense against the dark arts class. He noted the small fluctuations in the second presence, the way it grew weaker after meals, the way it grew slightly stronger when Quirrell had been alone for a number of hours, the way the back of Quirrell's turban gave off in a particular angle of afternoon sun in the Great Hall, the faintest possible odor of garlic that was a small protective practice. Harry suspected, the small protection of a man who knew he had been infested and was attempting by trivial means to keep the infestation polite. And the way Quirrell's eyes, when looked at directly with the new red ones, returned no chakra signature of their own at all. Because the chakra signature he should have had was, in the small horrified accountancy of Harry's analysis, being drained by the second presence and was, in measurable terms, nearly gone. He watched also the headmaster. He did not in 5 months see anything from Albus Dumbledore that he wished to report to Madame Bones. He did, however, note that the headmaster watched him as well, that the small steady gold of the headmaster's chakra was, at every meal, very slightly oriented in Harry's direction, in the small attentive way of a player at a chessboard who is watching the slow movement of a piece he had not quite known he had on the board, and who is trying, with the small private patience of an old player, to understand what kind of piece he has before he begins to play it. Harry, on this watching, did not, in any way that the headmaster could detect, return the look. He did, however, in his Sunday letter to Sirius on the 3rd week of November, ask very casually whether Sirius would, by long marauder experience, recommend any small minor tactics for keeping oneself off Albus Dumbledore's chessboard. Sirius had written back, "Pup, you cannot keep off Albus's chessboard. You can, however, decline to play the piece he thinks you are, be a different piece. Be patient, he will eventually understand. He is, in his way, decent, but he has played one too many games and he forgets, sometimes, that the pieces are also people." Harry had read this letter on a Tuesday morning over breakfast at the Slytherin table. He had folded it. He had put it in the inside pocket of his school robes, in the same pocket where, by an old habit beginning to acquire its shape, he carried the folded crane. In the 3rd week of March, the second presence in Quirrell increased in intensity. Harry noted this in a letter to Madame Bones. By the 2nd week of April, the increase had stabilized at a new and considerably higher baseline. By the 1st week of May, Harry had begun a small private investigation of the geography of the school's underground corridors. He had done so by Madame Bones's express instruction with another student as backup, and he had with some small reluctance recruited Hermione Granger, who had been delighted to be recruited, who had read every available pamphlet on castle architecture by the end of the first night, and who had by the second night identified by a small careful application of her own ingenuity the precise corridor along which Quirrell was, by the watching, performing his late-night reconnaissance. They had communicated by note. Harry had not, on Madame Bones's professional advice, told Ron. Ron, of all his friends, was the one who would, by his particular family history, have wanted to come along and would, by Harry's professional eye-watching judgment, have been the one most likely to be hurt. Harry had elected to bear that decision for him. By the 8th of June, in the late evening, Harry knew from a small accumulated set of observations that Quirrell was on the verge of his attempt. He sent a single short owl by the school's expedited service to Madame Bones at the ministry. He sent a second by the same service to Sirius at the cottage in Wales. He sent a third with the small private kindness he had been cultivating for some weeks to Albus Dumbledore, addressed by name, Headmaster's Tower, which said only, "Headmaster, tonight is the night. I am going to do what I think I should do. I have written also to Madame Bones, with respect, Harry." He had then, with the small, careful walk of a child who had spent the term preparing for this evening, gone down the corridor on the 3rd floor that he was not, in fact, supposed to be on, and had passed the sleeping Cerberus by the small expedient of the Sharingan's capacity at close range to read a creature's interior and apply a calibrated 3-note hum of inherited bloodline soothing. Hadis had taught him this in the 8th month of training. It was, she had said, the smallest possible use of the eyes that anyone has ever made, and one of the most useful, and had descended through the various preliminary chambers that the staff had, with what could only be described as theatrical pedagogical intent, arranged. He had passed each in turn with the small efficient grace of a child for whom the watching reduced each test to its constituent operational parameters. He had been, by the time he arrived at the final chamber, breathing slightly faster than usual but had not been in any meaningful sense taxed. Quirrell was waiting. Quirrell was standing in front of the mirror of Arist. The mirror was, by long Hogwarts tradition, the chamber's central installation. Quirrell at the mirror was visibly impatient. He turned as Harry entered. "You," said Quirrell. The voice was not entirely Quirrell's voice. The voice was, on the watching, layered. The layering was the small, dry, rasping voice of the second presence underneath, with the slightly stuttering voice of the man on top, and the man's voice was the smaller of the two. "Yes," said Harry. "Hello, Professor." He did not, by the watching, lift the small calibrated 3-note hum he had used on the Cerberus. He saw in the watching's clean assessment that the second presence in Quirrell would not, in his current state, be amenable to the hum. He saw also that the second presence was in the chamber in immeasurably more concentrated form than it had been in the Great Hall, that the chamber was, by virtue of the mirror's protective architecture, the only point in the school at which the second presence could, with effort, manifest properly. "Severus suspected," said Quirrell. "Severus was, of course, watching the wrong man. You are the one who has been watching me." "Yes." "How long?" "Since October, the 2nd week." "And you did not report me?" "I did report you to Madame Bones from October. I have been writing to her every 3 weeks. The second presence behind Quirrell hissed. The hissing was, in the watching, the small, horrified sound of a thing that had been operating all year, under the assumption that it was unobserved, only to discover that it had been observed continuously for 8 months by an 11-year-old child and a senior wizarding government official. The hissing modulated in the second into something almost approaching laughter. "He has been clever," said the hissing voice in the small, dry, rasping pitch of itself. "Quirrell, show me." Quirrell, by the watching, was unable to refuse. He unwound the turban. The back of his head, with the second face on it, looked at Harry directly. The face was small, white, almost lipless, with 2 thin red eyes the color of an old wound that had refused to close. Harry Potter, said the second face. Hello, Tom, said Harry in the small, careful, steady voice he had practiced for, by his own count, 63 nights in his bed at the cottage in Wales for precisely this moment. The second face did not in the moment register an emotion. It said only, where did you get that name? From Madame Bones. She got it from your old school records. She thought I should know. Clever woman. Yes, boy, I will offer you something once today. Hear me out, and then when I am done you may consider. All right, I want the stone. I know, the stone in the mirror will give itself to a person who looks into the mirror and wishes only to find it. I cannot in this body look into the mirror with the necessary purity. The body interferes. You are 11. You have not yet any wishes that the stone could not by some technical alternative also be one. You can look into the mirror and the mirror will give the stone to you and you will hand the stone to me. In return, boy, I will give you back your parents. There was in the chamber for 1 second a perfect silence. Harry looked at the face. The face was on the watching, smiling. The smile was the small, thin, practiced smile of an old liar who had been making this kind of offer to children for 50 years, and who had by his own internal calculation succeeded on roughly 38% of those occasions in obtaining the small, specific cooperation he required. Harry, in the small, careful, steady voice, said, Tom, yes, boy, I do not want my parents back. The face flinched. It was the first flinch the face had performed in living memory. It did not in the watching last long. It was, however, visible. Pardons. I do not want my parents back, Harry repeated with the small, steady gentleness of a child reading a difficult line in a play he has memorized. I would, of course, like to have had them. I would in my whole life have preferred to have had them. I have wished very many times that I had had them. But I do not today want them back. I do not want them back in particular by way of an offer from you. I want instead what I have made of my life so far. I want my godfather. I want my godfather's cousin and her family. I want my friends. I want my eyes. I want my country and the moon in it. I want my crane. I want the small honor guard of broken plastic soldiers that sit in the back of my wardrobe at the cottage in Wales. I want in addition the future. I want the future I have not yet lived. The future you are offering to interrupt with my dead parents is, despite your offer, not a future you are actually capable of granting. I have by careful instruction learned this. I do not therefore wish to make any trade with you. I wish, however, to make you an offer of my own. Will you hear it? The face in the watching was now flickering, was now visibly, in the small fluctuating darkness of its eyelight, beginning to suspect that the negotiation had sometime in the previous 30 seconds gone the wrong way. Boy, there is nothing you can offer me. There is, however, said Harry in the small, careful, steady voice, something I can offer you that does not depend on your consent. May I tell you what it is? Boy, Tsukuyomi. The chamber on the syllables of the word went still. The mirror of Arist behind Quirrell did not move, the flagstones did not move, the torches did not move. The second presence by the watching moved. It moved in the small, frantic way of a thing that knew the word and had not, in its small, accumulated catalogue of dangers across 50 years, ever expected to encounter the word being used against it by an 11-year-old British schoolchild. Quirrell raised his wand. He raised it. He did not, in the actual sense, get to use it. Harry, with the small, steady, patient unconcern of a child who had spent 3 years on the small inheritance of his eye's control, had in the half-second between the word and the wand met Voldemort's eye. There was, in the small particular country he built for Voldemort at 3 real-world seconds, no moon. The country he made for Voldemort did not need a moon. The country he made for Voldemort had instead a small wooden round table and 7 chairs around it, and in each of the 7 chairs in turn sat a small dignified spectral man or woman who had been called by the master of the table by one of 7 names, all of which Voldemort had once written into the small private wax-bound book of his oldest betrayals, and who would in the country for 72 subjective hours repeat back to the master of the table. In the small, careful voices the master remembered, the exact words the master had once spoken to them in the moment of betrayal. The 7 faces were Bellatrix's, Avery's, Karkaroff's, Lucius Malfoy's father's, Severus's, although Severus had not in the small careful watching of Harry's reconstruction been a betrayal of Voldemort but a betrayal of Lily, and so the Severus face spoke for Lily and not for himself. Mulciber's, and last in the 7th chair Pettigrew's. Pettigrew in the country sat for the longest time in the longest silence. Pettigrew did not in the country speak. Pettigrew only sat, with his small rat-soft hands folded, and looked at Voldemort across the table for the 72 hours and said nothing. Pettigrew in the country was the worst of the 7, because Pettigrew was the one who had betrayed for love of Voldemort and had then by Voldemort's casual indifference been forgotten about for the rest of his life, and was now sitting at the table in the small country with his rat-soft hands folded and looking at his old master with the small, unbearable, patient expression of a person who had in the end been betrayed by being betrayed of nothing at all. Voldemort in the country screamed. Voldemort screamed for the equivalent of 8 subjective hours, by Harry's later report to Madame Bones. The screaming did not bring help. The country, by Harry's small, careful architectural choice, was soundproofed. The screaming wore itself out at the end of the 8 hours. Then Voldemort, who had not in 50 years done anything resembling the act, began in the country very slowly to weep not at the betrayals which he did not by his nature regret, but at his own diminishment, at his own small, reduced wraith state condition, at the fact that he was a thing in a turban on a man's neck and had been so for 10 years and had in that decade accomplished nothing he had wanted to accomplish, and was, by the small chairs and the 7 figures and the rat-soft hands, being told with no narrator and no commentary, only by the slow chronology of his own remembered actions, that he had been, for some considerable length of his existence, simply a person who had ruined other persons' lives without producing anything of value, and that the producing nothing was the part of his record that he had, until this country, never had the misfortune to be made to look at squarely. He looked at it now, he could not stop looking at it, he looked at it for the remaining 64 subjective hours. In the real world, 3 seconds passed. Quirrell, who had not been the target of the technique, was still standing. The body of Quirrell, however, was no longer by the watching, hosting the second presence. The second presence had been, by the technique, dislodged, had been, by the practice of the country, broken, and was now in the chamber, drifting away from Quirrell's body in the form of a thin gray smoke. The smoke was the Horcrux fragment. The smoke was beginning on its drift to look for somewhere to go. Harry, with the small, careful, steady patience of 3 years of Haddis Yusuf's instruction, met the smoke's drift in the chamber with the small, careful operation he had been practicing for 14 months. He pointed neither his hand nor his eyes, he merely watched with the new red eye's small particular focus. A small black flame appeared in the chamber around the smoke. The smoke screamed. It screamed in the small, dry, incoherent scream of a thing that had been told for a long time that it was unburnable. The flame did not on the screaming alter, the flame burned the smoke. The burning took, by the chamber's wall clock, 23 seconds. At the end of the 23 seconds, the smoke was gone and the chamber, on inspection by the new red eyes, was clean. The flame, by Harry's small, careful look away, extinguished. Quirrell on the flagstones sat down. He had not been killed. He had been, by the slow drain of having hosted the second presence, severely depleted, and he would in the next 4 weeks in St. Mungo's be assessed, treated, and with the unanticipated dignity of a man whose body had been used and was now, against probability, his own again, be permitted by Madame Bones's intervention to retire to a small house in Albania he had once owned and to live, for the next 32 years of a life he had not previously expected, quietly and inoffensively. In a way that was, in his own small private internal accountancy, the only suitable response to a debt of life he could not otherwise repay. The mirror of Arist in the chamber did not on the events react. The Philosopher's Stone, which had been in Harry's pocket for the previous 48 hours by the small private cooperative magic of the mirror, Harry had not in fact gone to the chamber to retrieve it, because the mirror had, 3 nights earlier when he had passed by an unrelated corridor, simply delivered it into his cardigan pocket of its own accord, with the small mysterious courtesy of a magical object that had recognized in him exactly the kind of person it had been built to give itself to, was, on the present afternoon, going to be handed by Harry, through Madame Bones, to its rightful owner, Nicholas Flamel, who on receiving it would in the same fortnight with his wife Perenelle retire the stone permanently by way of a small private ceremony at their estate in Avignon, and would, with the small dignity of 2 people who had outlived their own desire to be alive, choose, by the next equinox, to release themselves into the next world. They had not in their long lives ever met Harry, they would never meet him. They would write him a single letter which Nicholas would dictate in halting French and which Perenelle would transcribe and which Madame Bones would pass on after their deaths and which would contain 3 words in beautiful handwriting, Merci June Hom. In the chamber, Harry sat down on the flagstones. The 7th rib on his left, by long practice, was no longer relevant. He was, however, very tired. He had used the eyes in the course of 7 minutes in 3 separate ways that none of his peers had ever used eyes for in their lives, and he had used them very hard. He let the watching, with the careful, patient practice of 3 years, retreat to the watchfire at the back of his mind. He let his eyes go back to green. He sat in the dim chamber for some time, with the mirror of Arist behind him, with the depleted Quirrell some feet away, with the empty air where the Horcrux had been, with the small, private, exhausted relief of a child who had finished an evening's work and could, on the small, careful permission of his own Bones, lie down. The door of the chamber opened. 8 minutes later, Madame Bones came in first. She had, by the small, careful coordination of the ministry's portkey system, arrived at Hogsmeade at exactly the moment her owl had been delivered, and she had not run because Madame Bones did not run, but she had walked extremely fast. Behind her, Albus Dumbledore came in slightly more slowly in a robe of midnight blue that, by the chamber's torchlight, looked oddly like an evening sky over a forest in the moment before the moon comes up. The 2 of them stopped just inside the door and looked. They looked at Quirrell, who was sitting on the flagstones, blinking, with the slightly empty face of a man who had just discovered he had his own body back and was uncertain what to do with it. They looked at the place where the smoke had been, which was now nothing. They looked at Harry, who had, on hearing the door with the small effort of an exhausted child, raised his head and turned it to look at them. Madame Bones said in her flat grocery list voice, "Mr. Potter?" "Yes, ma'am." "Are you injured?" "No, ma'am." "Did you do what I think you did?" "Yes, ma'am, I did." "Is the headmaster's stone safe?" Harry, with the small, careful motion of a child taking a polite object out of a pocket, removed the philosopher's stone from his cardigan and laid it gently on the flagstone in front of him. "Yes, ma'am." Madame Bones walked over. She picked up the stone. She did not in the moment look at Dumbledore. She put the stone in her own inside cloak pocket. She then turned with the small, careful patience of a woman who had spent 3 years preparing for this exact moment and was not going to allow it to be hurried, and looked at the headmaster of Hogwarts. "Albus, Amelia, we will speak in the morning. We will speak additionally at some length over the next several weeks. The boy will, by my office's order, be transferred this evening to the care of his godfather for the remainder of the school year. The school will, in his absence, complete the term. The boy will, before the start of next year, by my office's recommendation and his own consent, return to Hogwarts. The school will, by the same recommendation and consent, never again be the site at which an artifact of this kind is stored. We will additionally in the morning begin the discussion of the small matter we have been preparing to discuss for 3 years. Have I been clear?" Dumbledore, in his blue robes, looked at her for a long moment. He looked also with a small particular gentleness at Harry, who was still on the flagstones. He inclined his head. "You have been clear, Amelia. Good night, Albus. Good night, Amelia, Mr. Potter, headmaster. You have done very well, thank you, sir. I do not, by the way, intend to interfere with the next several weeks. I will, however, in time be available for any conversation you wish to have. I will write to you, sir, after the summer. That will be welcome, Mr. Potter. Good night." He turned, he left. Madame Bones in the chamber knelt down beside Harry very carefully as she had on the parquet of number 4 2 years before, and this time did not need a cloak. She did, however, put her hand very briefly on his shoulder. "All right, Mr. Potter. All right, ma'ams." Ups, he got up, he took her hand. They walked, the two of them, out of the chamber and up the various preliminary chambers, and along the corridor, and out of the third-floor passage that he was not supposed to have been on, and down the great curving stair, and along the long, quiet first-floor corridor, and out of the great oak doors of the school, and across the rain-wet lawn in the small late-evening dark to the front gate. At the front gate, by the small, steady mechanical hum of the school's permission system, a sight-along apparition point opened in the air. Madame Bones did not, on the apparition, sight along him herself. She had, in the 7 minutes since she had entered the chamber, sent her quietest signal by way of the small, silent communication system her office maintained with a particular family in Wales. The apparition opened. Sirius came through. Sirius did not, in the moment of his arrival, weep. He had been preparing for some weeks not to weep at this exact moment. He did, however, kneel down the way an adult kneels beside a child of equal rank, and he opened his arms. Harry walked into them. He stayed there for a long minute. Madame Bones, in the front gate dark, did not look at them. She turned a quarter turn, with the small private courtesy of a woman who had given a great deal of her career to the small matter of arranging the world such that, on certain late evenings, a godfather and a godson could embrace without the further interference of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and she looked instead at the small late roses on the gate-post. She left them alone with their reunion for as long as it lasted, which was, by her own private patient internal clock, 2.5 minutes. When Sirius stood up with Harry tucked against his side, she turned back, inclined her head, and said only, "Mr. Black. The school has expressed no objection to Mr. Potter's removal for the remainder of the term. I will personally take responsibility for the relevant paperwork. Take him home." Amelia: "Yes, thank you. You are welcome, Mr. Potter." "Yes, ma'am. You will, in time, receive a number of awards from various wizarding institutions for the small matter of tonight. I would advise you, by way of professional courtesy, to decline most of them. You will not, however, be able to decline any of them today. You may have a quiet 6 weeks. Beyond that, the world will, in its usual way, ask you to be in some sense its property. You may refuse that. I will support every refusal. You are not the world's, you are your own, do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good, Sirius. Amelia, take him home." The apparition closed. They were gone. Madame Bones, alone at the front gate of Hogwarts, did not in the moment follow. She stood for some time in the rain-wet dark, with her hands in the deep pockets of her cloak, looking up at the great dim shape of the school, and she allowed herself privately, internally, in the small inner office of her own selfhood, the small private satisfaction of a woman who had in 3 years brought a single difficult case to the conclusion she had always intended. The hospital wing, 2 days later at the cottage in Wales. There was technically no hospital wing in the cottage in Wales. Andromeda had, however, in the small, careful management of the household over 3 years, arranged the small back room next to the kitchen into something approximating one. A low single bed under the window, a small bedside table, a stocked cabinet of standard mending charm potions and bandages, and the small, specific sharing and recovery decoction Hadis Yusuf had taught her to prepare. Harry had been moved on his arrival home into this small back room at his own quiet request because he had not in the moment wanted to climb the stairs. He had been there for 2 days. He had slept for most of the first day. He had eaten on the second morning a piece of toast. He had taken on the second afternoon a small bowl of soup. He was, by Andromeda's careful watching, recovering at exactly the rate her professional reading had told her to expect. In the early evening, Sirius came in. He sat in the small, low chair next to the bed. He did not in the moment speak. He had been there on and off for 2 days, and Harry knew him well enough by now that there was no need for the kind of quick, courteous greetings he might have provided a stranger. Sirius looked at Harry. Harry, with the new green eyes, the watching today was entirely at the watchfire of his head, and he was, in the careful sense, just a boy in the bed, looked back. Pup, Sirius. Are you all right? Yes, tired, otherwise all right. Sirius nodded. He looked at his own hands briefly. He looked back at Harry. I have, he said, something I have been thinking about that I wanted to say when you were able to hear it. May I say it now? Yes, Sirius cleared his throat. The clearing was the small, careful clearing of a man who had been preparing a sentence for some weeks and was, in the moment, slightly uncertain how to deliver it. He said, Your mum would have cried laughing, pup. Harry in the bed considered this for the small length of one slow breath. He smiled very slightly. The smile was not large. The smile was, however, the smile of an 11-year-old who, despite everything, had a small, private, specific piece of news to share on the question of whether his mother had, in fact, cried laughing. He said in the small, careful, steady voice he had inherited without entirely knowing it from somewhere very far back. She did. I saw her in the illusion. She was proud. Sirius did not in the moment weep. He had been preparing not to weep. He inclined his head very slightly and looked briefly at the floor of the small back room of the cottage, and then back at Harry, and he nodded. He said nothing. In the corner of the room, on the small, low bedside table, the folded yellow paper crane sat in the late evening light and was, in the way of inherited objects, watching. Outside the window, on the small back lawn, the magpie that had been crossing the garden on and off for 2.5 years sat on the gatepost in the gathering dark and tucked one foot up and stayed. The kettle in the kitchen began to whistle. Andromeda's footsteps moved in the small, ordinary way across the floorboards. Ted called something to Tonks. Remus, who had arrived for tea, laughed quietly at a joke nobody else heard. In the bed, Harry closed his green eyes and slept. And the country of his life, the new country, the one he had been building for 3 years across the wood behind the cottage and the small kitchen table and the chessboard with Ted and the small wooden box on the windowsill, went on with him in it. And did not, on the small ordinary evening of his first evening home after his first year of his real school, end.